My name is Caitlin Thompson, and I am 32 years old. The sound of a mother choosing a party over her daughter's life does not arrive as a shout. It arrives as the sterile click of a disconnected line. Before that click, there was the blinding white of a Colorado blizzard on Interstate 70, the black ice, the semi-truck sliding across 3 lanes, the crunch of folding metal, then nothing but the frantic rhythm of a heart monitor in a Denver trauma unit. Each beep felt like a hammer striking my fractured ribs. A nurse had placed my cracked phone on the tray table. With fingers that felt like wet sand, I reached for it. I bypassed Julian, knowing my husband's flight from Chicago was grounded by the same storm, and I pressed my mother's name. It rang 4 times. "Caitlin, this is not a good time." Barbara's voice drifted through the speaker, clipped and tight. Underneath her impatience, I could hear a string quartet playing something light and elegant. Ice clinked against crystal. My sister Peyton's Aspen wedding reception was in full swing, 50 miles and an entire universe away from the scent of iodine surrounding my bed. "Mom," I managed my voice a fragile rasp. "I was in an accident. I am at Denver General." A pause stretched across the connection. I waited for the shift. The sudden intake of breath, the maternal panic, the immediate demand to know which room I was in. Instead, Barbara sighed. The sound carried the distinct exhaustion of a woman inconvenienced. "We cannot leave your sister's wedding, Caitlin. They are about to cut the cake. Stop making a scene and let the doctors do their jobs. I will call you tomorrow." No questions about my injuries, no promises to drive down the mountain, just the click of the line going dead. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance. This is a place where we share real stories about the families we are given, the boundaries we build, and the receipts we keep. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from today. It helps more than you know. And be sure to subscribe. I stared at the shattered screen of my phone. The dial tone hummed a flat, indifferent note. I could picture the scene perfectly. Barbara slipping the phone back into her beaded clutch, smoothing her silk gown, and turning a practiced smile back toward the country club elite. A multi-tiered cake built for optics, prioritized over the daughter currently breathing through a bruised lung. The silence in the hospital room pressed down on the thin cotton sheets. I grew up in a household where love was treated like a scarce commodity, and Peyton was the account that always received the deposits. Peyton was the pageant winner, the cheerleader, the girl whose high school graduation warranted a catered dinner for 60 people. I was the quiet one, the one who preferred numbers to people. By the time I was 18, I was already balancing my father's small business ledgers, finding errors his actual accountant missed. I became a forensic accountant because I learned early on that people lie, but math never does. My parents relied on my quiet competence, but they saved their applause for Peyton. For 32 years, I operated as the family shock absorber, taking the slights, absorbing the disregard, hoping the equation would eventually balance. Lying under those harsh fluorescent lights, the arithmetic finally became clear. My value to them was 0. I did not cry. Tears required an emotional currency I refused to spend on them anymore. I set the phone face down on the tray. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me, chilling the lingering panic in my veins. If I was not worth a hospital visit, they were not worth another second of my life. I would not beg for a place at their table. I would build my own, and they would never be invited to sit at it. The ledger was officially closed. I just needed someone to guard the door while I rebuilt the walls. And as the trauma bay doors swung open, the person who walked through was the last individual my mother would ever expect. The heavy trauma unit doors swung open with a pneumatic hiss. I braced myself for another exhausted resident holding a clipboard. Instead, the woman who walked into the room wore a tailored charcoal blazer and carried a leather briefcase that looked dense enough to break glass. Maya. She was Julian's business partner and former law school colleague. While Julian had transitioned into corporate consulting, Maya had remained on the litigation track. She was a woman who navigated hostile boardrooms the way a shark navigates a coral reef. Her parents had immigrated from Bogota when she was a child, and she had spent her entire life proving she belonged in rooms that systematically tried to keep her out. Maya did not trade in soft comforts or empty platitudes. We shared a mutual respect built on a common language: precision. Maya bypassed the flimsy plastic visitor chairs and walked straight to the foot of my bed. her dark eyes scanning the medical chart clipped to the rail. "Julian is trapped at O'Hare," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet, steady authority she usually reserved for cross-examinations. "He put me on the first available flight out of Midway. I left a corporate deposition on the table. Opposing counsel is currently having a panic attack, but that is his problem. You are my problem now." She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not offer a pitying smile. She simply set her briefcase on the linoleum floor, pulled out her phone, and began dialing the hospital billing department. For the next 4 hours, Maya became a human shield. When a nurse tried to delay my pain medication, Maya intercepted her in the hallway, citing patient care statutes, until the dosage arrived 3 minutes later. When the insurance representative called to dispute my emergency room coverage, I listened to Maya dismantle the agent with a terrifying, icy calm. "My client is a Tier 1 trauma admission," Maya stated, her gaze fixed on the snow swirling outside my window. "You will process the preliminary code as a catastrophic injury without delay, or I will personally depose your department head by Tuesday morning." The contrast was staggering. My own mother, sharing my DNA, had deemed my survival an inconvenience to her social calendar. Maya, bound to me only by my marriage to her friend, had dropped a career-defining case to ensure I was not alone in a sterile room. Around midnight, the hospital quieted down. The snowstorm continued to bury Denver, blanketing the city in a heavy, isolating silence. Maya pulled a chair close to my bed. She retrieved her phone from her pocket and unlocked the screen. "You need to see this, Caitlin," she said softly. "Not to hurt you, to cure you." She turned the screen toward me. It was Barbara's social media feed. The images were crisp, bright, and suffocating. Peyton standing in her custom silk gown holding a flute of champagne, Trent, my new brother-in-law, flashing a perfectly capped smile, and there was Barbara standing next to a towering 6-tier wedding cake adorned with edible gold leaf. The caption beneath the photo read, "The perfect day. Nothing matters more than family." I stared at the glowing screen. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical cut. My mother was broadcasting her devotion to family while her youngest daughter lay tethered to a heart monitor 50 miles away. The cake was pristine, structurally flawless, and entirely hollow on the inside. It was the perfect monument to the people who raised me. "Can you reach my phone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Maya handed me the cracked device. I unlocked it. I opened my contacts. I did not draft a dramatic text message detailing my pain. I did not leave a tearful voicemail begging for an explanation. Explanations were for people who misunderstood each other. Barbara and I understood each other perfectly. I scrolled to my father's name, Richard Thompson. I tapped the screen, block caller. I scrolled to Peyton, block caller. Finally, I scrolled to Barbara, the woman who taught me that love was a transaction I could never quite afford. I pressed the button, block caller. I set the phone down. The physical pain in my chest remained, but the psychological weight I had carried for 3 decades evaporated. The ghosting was immediate, complete, and silent. I was done waiting for a seat at their table. Julian arrived 36 hours later, exhausted and pale, rushing into the room with snow still clinging to his overcoat. When he held my hand, the final piece of my psychological fortress clicked into place. Blood obligation had failed me, but my chosen family had crossed state lines and braved a blizzard to stand guard at my door. The physical recovery took 6 weeks. The mental pivot took less than an hour. Sitting at our dining room table with Julian and Maya wrapped in a heavy wool sweater, I laid out the blueprint for my survival. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days hunting down hidden assets, unearthing dummy corporations, and finding the truth buried beneath layers of corporate deceit. If my biological family survived on optics and lies, I would build a kingdom on undeniable, audited facts. "We are starting our own firm," I announced, sliding a legal pad across the table. "Julian, you handle the strategic consulting. I will manage the forensic auditing. Maya, I want you to leave your firm and join us as chief legal counsel." Maya looked at the legal pad, then up at me, her lips curved into a sharp smile. I was getting bored with my partners anyway. We built the empire from the ground up. We leased a sleek, modern office space in downtown Denver, trading the traditional mahogany and leather for glass walls and steel fixtures. We wanted transparency. We wanted precision. For 3 years, I channeled every ounce of grief, every lingering memory of that hospital room, into the work. Forensic accounting is not just mathematics. It is warfare conducted through spreadsheets. It requires a predator's instinct. I tore through corrupted corporate ledgers, exposing embezzlers and restructuring bankruptcies for high-net-worth clients. Julian brought in the clientele, and Maya ensured our contracts were bulletproof. We formed an ironclad inner circle. During those 3 years, the silence from Aspen remained unbroken. My parents made no serious effort to bypass the digital walls I had erected. They preferred the narrative that I was the selfish daughter who had distanced herself, rather than confront the reality of their own neglect. I let them keep their fiction. I was too busy building my reality. By our 3rd year, the firm was pulling in revenue numbers that made established Denver institutions nervous. We were untouchable, independent, and entirely self-made. I had achieved my ultimate goal. I never had to rely on anyone's conditional love again. But quiet success eventually makes noise. We had just entered the final vetting stages for a transformative federal auditing contract. Securing the bid would elevate our firm to the national stage. It required absolute pristine optics. Any hint of scandal, any financial messiness associated with our names would instantly tank the deal. We kept our heads down, focused entirely on the vetting process. Then, a prominent Denver business magazine decided to run a feature on the city's fastest-growing financial sectors. They requested an interview. Julian handled the press, keeping the focus on our methodology rather than our personal lives. When the issue hit the newsstands, I walked into the lobby of our building and saw my own face staring back at me from the glossy cover. The headline read, "The Unseen Architect of Denver's Financial Truth." The article was flattering. It was professional. It also estimated our firm's valuation in the tens of millions. I bought a copy, carried it up to my glass-walled office, and dropped it onto my desk. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew exactly how information traveled in this state. That magazine would inevitably find its way into the high-end salons and country clubs of Aspen. My ghosting was over. Not by my choice, but by unwanted visibility. For 3 years, I had been the discarded, ignored daughter. Now the arithmetic had shifted. I was no longer an inconvenience. I was a highly visible, incredibly wealthy target. And somewhere in the mountains, the people who had abandoned me were about to look at those numbers and realize they needed a bailout. 3 years is exactly 1,095 days. In the world of forensic accounting, 1,000 days is enough time to track a shell company across 4 continents, unearth a decade of buried embezzlement, and restructure a failing corporate empire. For me, it was the exact amount of time it took to build a fortress so high that the air around it felt permanently cold. We secured the 40th floor of a high-rise in downtown Denver. The aesthetic of our firm reflected our methodology: glass walls, polished concrete floors, steel fixtures. We designed an environment where transparency was mandatory and shadows had nowhere to hide. Julian navigated the boardrooms, securing contracts with tech conglomerates and private equity groups who suspected internal bleeding. I ran the numbers. I spent my days inside corrupted ledgers, tracing fraudulent wire transfers and decoding phantom payrolls. Maya stood at the gate, drafting ironclad non-disclosure agreements and tearing opposing counsel to shreds whenever a target tried to hide behind litigation. We were a machine, we were lucrative, and we were entirely out of reach from the people who shared my last name. During those 3 years, the silence from the mountains remained unbroken. My parents preferred the narrative they had constructed for their country club friends. I was the difficult daughter, the workaholic who had drifted away, leaving them blameless and comfortably tragic. I allowed them their fiction. I was too busy dealing in facts, but quiet success eventually attracts loud scrutiny. By our 3rd year, the firm was no longer just a boutique operation. We were a recognized authority in the Rocky Mountain financial sector. That reputation earned us a seat at a very exclusive table. We were 30 days away from finalizing a sweeping federal auditing contract with the Department of Infrastructure. Securing this bid meant overseeing the allocation of billion-dollar federal grants across the Western grid. It was the kind of contract that transformed a successful business into a legacy institution. The vetting process was brutal. The federal government does not hand over its ledgers to anyone with a shadow. FBI background checks, deep dives into our personal financials, and rigorous audits of our own tax histories were daily occurrences. Maya handled the compliance officers with her usual surgical precision, but the mandate from Washington was clear. Our optics had to remain pristine. Any hint of public scandal, any messy litigation, or any association with financial impropriety would trigger an immediate disqualification. We were walking a tightrope lined with razor wire, and we could not afford a single gust of wind. Then the mail arrived. I was at my desk reviewing a discrepancy in a logistics contract when my assistant set a small stack of envelopes next to my monitor. Most were standard corporate correspondence. One was not. It was a square envelope, pale pink, with my office address written in a loopy, practiced cursive. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Peyton. I picked up the envelope. The paper was cheap, the kind bought in bulk from a discount pharmacy, a stark contrast to the custom-embossed stationery my sister usually favored. The postmark was stamped Aspen, dated 4 days prior. A return address was scrawled in the corner bearing the name of the sprawling estate she shared with her husband, Trent. I did not open it. I did not need to. I held the envelope up to the overhead light, tracing the faint outline of a generic greeting card inside. A belated, empty gesture arriving 1,000 days too late. Why now Peyton had ignored my hospital stay, my recovery, and the launch of my business. She had spent the last 3 years curating her image as the flawless Aspen socialite. She did not reach out randomly. She reached out because she needed something. I set the envelope down and turned to my keyboard. I logged into a proprietary database used by real estate analysts, typing Trent's name into the search bar. The results populated within seconds, painting a picture clearer than any tearful phone call ever could. Trent was a developer who traded on his country club charm and my parents' social connections. The screen showed his latest commercial project, a luxury retail plaza outside Vail, was stalled. Construction permits had expired. 3 separate liens had been filed by local contractors for unpaid labor. His debt-to-equity ratio was spiraling out of control. The pristine facade of Peyton's marriage was cracking under the weight of severe financial decay. She was sending a cheap card because the accounts that funded her designer lifestyle were drying up. I picked up the pink envelope. I did not tear it. I did not throw it in the trash. I placed it inside a rigid corporate mailer, printed a label, and stamped it with bright red ink. Certified mail, return to sender. I handed it back to my assistant. I wanted Peyton to sign for it. I wanted her to look at the unopened envelope and understand that my boundaries were not negotiable. I felt a brief, cold satisfaction tracking the tracking number later that week, knowing the exact minute it landed back on her doorstep. But my satisfaction was premature. I had successfully defended the perimeter, but I had underestimated the incoming storm. The following Tuesday, Julian walked into my office. He did not knock. He did not offer his usual morning greeting. He carried a fresh copy of the Denver Business Executive, the premier financial publication in the state. He set it on my glass desk, his expression tight. "We told them to focus on the methodology," Julian said, his voice low. The editor decided to take a different angle. I looked down at the glossy cover. My own face stared back at me, photographed during a panel discussion I had attended a month prior. I looked sharp, focused, and entirely unaware of the target being painted on my back. The headline stretched across the bottom in bold, unforgiving ink: "The Unseen Architect of Denver's Financial Truth." It was an aggressive, flattering profile, but the prose was not the problem. The problem was the pull quote centered on the second page of the feature. The journalists had bypassed our press protocols and consulted external industry analysts. They published a detailed speculative breakdown of our recent acquisitions and client roster. The final paragraph contained a number that made the blood freeze in my veins. The analysts estimated our firm's current valuation at $35 million. I stared at the printed digits. $35 million. In the world of federal contracting, it was a badge of honor. In the ecosystem of my estranged family, it was blood in the water. Julian pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "Maya just saw it. She is already on the phone with the publisher reminding them of the non-disclosure agreements regarding our client list. But the valuation number is out there. It is public record now." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. The ghosting was over. I had built a fortress to keep my family out, but I had accidentally built it so high that it could be seen from the mountains. I knew exactly how this publication circulated. It was the preferred reading material in the private lounges, golf clubs, and ski resort lobbies of Aspen. It was read by investors, developers, and desperate men looking for a lifeline. The dynamic had flipped in the span of a single morning. I was no longer the discarded daughter, whose absence was a convenient relief. I was a highly visible, incredibly wealthy target. And I was standing right in the middle of a federal vetting process where I could not afford to swing a bat. 50 miles away, the mountain air was thin and crisp. I could picture the sequence of events with forensic clarity. The morning mail delivery at the country club, the stack of magazines placed neatly on a polished silver tray, a desperate developer nursing a morning scotch looking for a distraction from the contractors calling his cell phone. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the city traffic far below my window, knowing that the fuse had just been lit. The magazine was already traveling. It was moving through the pristine, snow-lined streets of Aspen. It was being carried through heavy oak doors, and with a soft, definitive thud, the glossy cover featuring my $35 million valuation landed square in the center of Trent's custom mahogany table. The Pine Creek Club in Aspen smelled of roasted cedar, high-altitude air, and single malt scotch. At a corner table situated near a towering stone fireplace, Trent swirled an amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass. He wore a tailored cashmere blazer that cost more than most working families earned in a month. Across from him sat two prospective investors, men who controlled regional pension funds and sought quiet places to park their capital. "Liquidity is never an issue for my developments," Trent stated, leaning forward to project an aura of effortless dominance. "Our portfolio is insulated from market fluctuations. Legacy wealth remains impenetrable, gentlemen. We build legacies, not just properties." He smiled, flashing pristine veneers that caught the firelight. The investors nodded, captivated by the performance. Trent was a maestro of the veneer. He had married my sister Peyton 6 years ago, stepping seamlessly into the role of the golden son-in-law. My mother Barbara adored him because his family name carried historical weight in Colorado commercial real estate. What Barbara steadfastly refused to acknowledge was that Trent's father had quietly severed his son's access to the family trust years ago. The patriarch had grown tired of underwriting a string of failed commercial gambles. Peyton and Trent sustained their flawless image through high-interest credit lines, leased European sports cars, and staggering denial. As Trent signaled a waiter for another round of drinks, his gaze drifted toward the club's polished mahogany reading table. A stack of fresh publications sat arranged in a neat fan. The top issue featured a familiar face. My face. 50 miles away, inside a climate-controlled server room in downtown Denver, I was staring at a very different reality. The magazine publication had forced my hand, accelerating a defensive strategy I had hoped to delay. I could not afford blind spots while the federal vetting process remained active. If my family decided to initiate contact, I needed to understand their exact financial leverage. Using our proprietary auditing software, I pulled the property records, tax filings, and corporate registrations for every entity tied to my brother-in-law. The math displayed on my monitors was brutal. While Trent pitched his impenetrable wealth over premium scotch, I watched a cascading sequence of financial ruin map itself across my screens. His flagship project, a luxury retail plaza outside Vail, was cross-collateralized with his primary residence. He had taken out mezzanine loans at loan shark interest rates just to cover the monthly minimums on his heavy construction equipment leases. His debt-to-equity ratio was not merely dangerous, it was terminal. If a single creditor called in a note, or if a supplier filed a grievance, the entire structure would collapse into dust. It would take Peyton's designer wardrobe and Barbara's carefully curated social standing down into the crater with it. Trent was treading water with an iron safe chained to his ankle, smiling at the other swimmers. Back at the country club, Trent picked up the magazine. The bold headline caught the overhead lighting. He read the analyst's valuation printed on page 2. $35 million. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. The crystal glass slipped a fraction of an inch in his grip before he tightened his knuckles. He abruptly excused himself from the investors, citing an urgent phone call, and walked briskly toward the valet stand. He drove straight to my parents' estate, pushing his vehicle well over the mountain speed limits. Barbara was in her sunroom, arranging imported orchids, when Trent dropped the magazine onto the glass patio table. The sound shattered the quiet afternoon. Peyton sat on a velvet sofa nearby, scrolling mindlessly through a tablet. "Read the second page," Trent instructed. His voice lacked its usual polished cadence, reduced to a hollow rasp. Barbara adjusted her reading glasses. Her eyes tracked the column of text. I knew my mother well enough to map the exact sequence of expressions crossing her features. First came disbelief, a rejection of a reality she did not authorize. Next came a flash of indignation, insulted that the daughter she discarded had thrived without her permission. Finally, the indignation gave way to something far more dangerous, frigid calculation. Peyton leaned over to look at the numbers. 35 million, she whispered. Her voice was laced with a potent mixture of envy and desperate hope. "We have a liquidity crisis," Trent announced to the room, instantly abandoning the impenetrable wealth narrative he had spun just an hour prior. "The Vail contractors are filing liens tomorrow morning. The bank is threatening to accelerate the mezzanine note. If we do not secure a substantial capital injection by the end of the month, the house goes into foreclosure." Barbara slowly closed the magazine. She did not panic. She viewed the revelation not as a tragedy but as a providential opportunity. A forgotten asset had just matured, and she fully intended to collect the dividend. "Caitlin has always been stubborn," Barbara mused, smoothing an invisible crease in her silk blouse. "But she is still family. She just needs to be reminded of her obligations." A reconnaissance mission was born in the shadow of those orchids. They could not send Trent. I had never liked him, and his desperation would reek. They could not send Richard because my father possessed the diplomatic skills of a frightened rabbit and would likely fold under pressure. The task required a gentle touch, a Trojan horse designed to slip past the heavy iron gates of my newly built life. Peyton was selected for the role. She possessed the necessary biological leverage. They shared a history of childhood bedrooms and whispered secrets, a bond Barbara assumed could be weaponized to extract a 7-figure bailout. The objective was straightforward. Peyton would travel to Denver, locate me in a setting where I could not easily walk away, and deploy a calculated mix of sisterly warmth and shared nostalgia. She would extract information about my firm's liquid capital and pave the way for a formal financial request. The strategy relied on a fatal assumption. They believed I was the same quiet approval-seeking girl they had abandoned in a hospital bed 3 winters ago. They thought my silence was born of injured pride, a temporary tantrum waiting for a gilded invitation back to the fold. Peyton accepted the assignment with desperate enthusiasm. Her entire lifestyle was evaporating. The country club memberships, the ski chalets, the private school tuitions for children she eventually planned to have, all of it hinged on gaining access to the vault I had spent 3 years filling. She spent 2 days tracking my movements. My firm kept a tight digital footprint, but Julian and Maya maintained active client-facing schedules. A junior associate at a rival accounting firm, eager to impress a wealthy Aspen socialite, confirmed a lucrative rumor. The senior partners at my firm held a standing reservation every Thursday evening at a Michelin-starred steakhouse in the Cherry Creek district. Peyton packed an overnight bag. She selected her wardrobe with surgical intent. A muted cashmere sweater, understated jewelry, designer flats. She wanted to look successful but accessible. Wealthy but perhaps seeking a deeper connection. A sister yearning to heal an old wound. She drove down Interstate 70, passing the exact mile marker where a sliding semi-truck had crushed my ribs. She did not look at the spot. Her mind was entirely focused on the performance ahead. The Denver Steakhouse was a cavern of dark wood brass accents and low ambient lighting. The air hummed with the quiet negotiations of the city's power brokers. Peyton arrived 20 minutes early. She slipped the hostess a crisp $100 bill to secure a booth near the private dining alcove, ensuring a clear line of sight to the main entrance. She ordered sparkling water and waited. She rehearsed her opening lines. A soft gasp of surprise, a hesitant smile, a gentle touch on the forearm. "Oh, Caitlin, I had no idea you would be here. It has been too long. I have missed you so much." The trap was set. The bait was polished. Peyton sat in the dim lighting, armed with false warmth and an agenda driven entirely by greed, waiting for the discarded sister to walk into the crosshairs. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy brass doors of the restaurant swung open. The host stepped forward to greet the new arrivals. Peyton straightened her spine, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pasted the hesitant, loving smile onto her face and stood up from the booth, ready to leverage a lifetime of guilt. She took a step forward, blissfully unaware of the fortress I had built, and wholly blind to the predator who was actually waiting on the other side of that door. I build timelines for a living. Reconstructing an event from disparate data points is the very foundation of forensic accounting. So when Maya walked into my office the following morning and set a crumpled merchant copy of a restaurant receipt on my glass desk, I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how the ambush had played out. I was supposed to be at the Cherry Creek Steakhouse that night. Securing the corner booth every Thursday was a tradition Julian and I started when the firm was just a concept on a legal pad. But a sudden discrepancy in a federal compliance document had kept me chained to my monitors. I told Julian and Maya to take the client dinner without me. That singular scheduling shift turned Peyton's meticulously planned reconnaissance mission into a spectacular miscalculation. At 7 o'clock, the heavy brass doors of the restaurant swung open. Peyton stood near the hostess stand, smoothing her cashmere sweater, her heart undoubtedly racing with the thrill of the impending manipulation. She scanned the dim wood-paneled dining room and spotted Julian. He was seated in our usual booth, reviewing a wine list with two prospective clients. The seat across from him, the one Peyton assumed would hold her estranged, vulnerable sister, was occupied by a woman in a tailored suit. Peyton did not retreat. Armed with the arrogant assumption that her social grace could conquer any room, she approached the table. She pasted on a hesitant, loving smile, preparing to perform the role of the worried sibling reaching across the divide. "Excuse me," Julian Peyton said, letting her voice carry just enough to ensure the clients heard her. "I hope I am not interrupting. I was just hoping to catch Caitlin. It has been so long since she spoke to the family." Julian looked up. His expression did not register surprise, only a flat, polite endurance. Before he could respond, Maya placed her menu on the table. Maya knew exactly who Peyton was. I had shown her the wedding photos 3 years prior in the hospital. Maya possessed a photographic memory for faces, statutes, and liabilities. She analyzed Peyton the way a litigator evaluates a hostile witness stepping onto the stand, noting the slight tremor in Peyton's hands and the forced widening of her eyes. "Caitlin is unavailable tonight," Maya stated, her voice a smooth, low register that commanded immediate authority. "I am Maya, her business partner and chief legal counsel. You must be Peyton." Peyton faltered, the rehearsed script suddenly useless. She recovered quickly, slipping into the booth uninvited, leaning forward to project an aura of intimate concern. "It is a pleasure," Peyton replied. "I just wanted to check on her. We were all so heartbroken when she abandoned us. She has a habit of running away when things get difficult, you know. My mother worries constantly, but seeing the recent news, it looks like she is managing her little firm quite well." The phrasing was a calculated insult disguised as praise. Peyton was fishing for valuation details, testing the waters to see if the $35 million figure printed in the magazine held any weight. She expected Maya to offer polite corporate deflections. She expected to leverage social etiquette to extract intelligence. Maya did not play by country club rules. "Abandonment implies a duty of care that was discarded," Maya replied, her tone perfectly level. "Self-preservation is the act of removing oneself from a toxic environment to ensure survival. Caitlin did not abandon your family. She amputated a liability. There is a distinct legal difference." A mottled red flush crept up Peyton's neck, clashing with the soft fabric of her sweater. The clients at the table fell silent, captivated by the sudden drop in the atmospheric pressure. "I am just trying to look out for my sister," Peyton countered, her voice pitching an octave higher. "Sudden wealth can be overwhelming. My husband Trent handles private equity, and he was hoping to offer her some guidance, to keep her grounded." Maya picked up her water glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip before setting it back on the linen tablecloth. "Your husband," Maya said, locking her dark eyes onto Peyton, "is currently carrying a debt load that exceeds his liquid assets by a ratio of 4 to 1. The contractors on his Vail project are filing liens as we speak. His mezzanine lenders are preparing to call their notes by the end of the fiscal quarter. He does not manage equity. He manages a highly flammable house of cards. I would advise against offering financial guidance to a woman who builds federal auditing protocols before her morning coffee." The silence that followed was suffocating. Peyton stared at Maya, her lips parted, the air completely knocked from her lungs. The designer facade she had spent years cultivating was stripped away in 3 sentences, leaving nothing but the stark, undeniable reality of her financial desperation exposed under the dim restaurant lighting. She had walked into the lion's den expecting to find a wounded gazelle, only to discover the perimeter was guarded by a legal predator. Desperate to salvage any remaining shred of dignity, Peyton signaled the waiter. She had ordered a premium cocktail at the bar while waiting for our table, and she needed to close her tab before she fled. "I will just pay for my drink and leave," Peyton muttered, refusing to meet Maya's gaze. The waiter arrived holding a leather folio. Peyton reached into her designer handbag, retrieving a sleek platinum credit card, and dropped it onto the tray with a practiced flick of her wrist. The waiter bowed slightly and disappeared toward the point-of-sale terminal. For 2 agonizing minutes, nobody spoke. Julian resumed his quiet conversation with the clients, rendering Peyton entirely invisible. Maya simply watched her expression unreadable. When the waiter returned, his posture was rigid. He leaned down, pitching his voice to a discreet whisper meant only for Peyton. "I am sorry, madam. The card was declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Peyton froze. Her hands began to shake in earnest now. She fumbled through her wallet, pulling out a secondary card tied to a different bank, her breathing shallow and ragged. The waiter took it, walked away, and returned a moment later with the exact same grim expression: insufficient funds. The silence at the table transformed into a crushing weight. Peyton looked down at her hands, the reality of her husband's crumbling empire manifesting in a plastic rectangle that possessed 0 purchasing power. She was trapped in a high-end restaurant, unable to afford a single glass of gin. Maya did not smile. She did not offer a condescending remark. In a silent, humiliating display of absolute dominance, Maya reached into her blazer, produced a heavy corporate card, and handed it to the waiter. "Put her tab on our firm's account," Maya instructed smoothly. "Consider it a charitable contribution." Peyton stood up so fast her chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. She did not say thank you. She did not say goodbye. She grabbed her handbag and practically ran toward the brass doors, her composure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The drive back up the mountain to Aspen was a blur of black asphalt and swirling snow. Peyton gripped the steering wheel, tears of profound humiliation stinging her eyes. She had been sent to extract a quiet surrender, and she was returning with a terrifying revelation. I was not the isolated, vulnerable sister they remembered. I was shielded by an impenetrable chosen family, a fortress of loyal, ruthless operators who could not be manipulated by blood ties or false nostalgia. When Peyton finally reached the sprawling estate, she found Barbara waiting in the sitting room, a cup of herbal tea resting on her lap. Trent paced the length of the Persian rug, chewing on his thumbnail. "Well," Barbara asked, looking up with expectant eyes, "did she agree to meet?" Peyton dropped her handbag onto a leather ottoman. Her hands were still trembling. "She was not there," Peyton said, her voice hollow. "Her lawyer was. They know everything, Trent. They know about the Vail liens. They know about the mezzanine debt. They pulled our public records." Trent stopped pacing. The color drained from his face again, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a man. Barbara slowly set her teacup onto its matching saucer. The delicate clink of porcelain echoed in the quiet room. Her calculation adjusted. The soft manipulation tactic was dead upon arrival. Guilt trips required a receptive audience, and I had hired a bouncer to keep the audience out of the theater. "If they want my money," Barbara realized, with a cold, terrifying clarity, "they will not get it by asking nicely." The polite approach had failed. The invisible war had just shifted into open hostility. If they were going to crack the vault, they would have to force my hand, setting the stage for a confrontation that could not be fought in the shadows. Richard Thompson spent his entire marriage perfecting the art of blending into the wallpaper. He was a man who constructed his life around the path of least resistance. Growing up, I understood the unspoken rules of our household. Barbara dictated the terms of our reality, Peyton reaped the rewards, and my father simply nodded to keep the peace. He owned a regional logistics company managing trucking routes across the state, yet in his own living room, he carried 0 authority. He was the kind of father who would slip a $20 bill into my coat pocket after my mother berated my career choices in front of her friends, whispering that he was proud of me. Private sympathy, public betrayal. He believed those quiet, hidden moments of kindness absolved him from his failure to protect me in the open. I stepped off the private elevator onto the 40th floor of our firm. The polished concrete floors reflected the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was reviewing a quarterly tax projection on my tablet, my mind occupied with federal compliance codes when I looked up and saw him. Richard was sitting on the edge of a sleek leather waiting sofa in our reception area. Our building maintains strict access protocols, requiring verified key cards and scheduled appointments to breach the upper levels. He must have slipped past the ground floor turnstiles by tailgating a delivery courier, utilizing the same quiet invisibility he had honed over 3 decades of a stifling marriage. He looked older. The gray at his temples had spread, and the shoulders of his wool overcoat slumped under a heavy, invisible weight. In his right hand, he clutched a small, generic paper sleeve, a coffee shop gift card. My pulse remained steady. The shock I might have felt 3 years ago was replaced by a clinical, detached curiosity. "Katie," he said, his voice carrying a nervous tremor. He stood up, dropping his gaze to the floor before forcing himself to meet my eyes. "My name is Caitlin," I replied, stopping 10 feet away from him. He flinched at the correction. He took a hesitant step forward, extending the hand holding the paper sleeve. "I brought you this, from that roastery near your old apartment. I remembered you liked their espresso." I looked at the thin piece of cardboard, a $20 peace offering for 1,000 days of silence. It was the ultimate enabler tactic, a cheap, trivial gesture designed to bypass accountability and reset the clock without ever acknowledging the damage done. "How did you get into this lobby, Richard?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above the collar of his woolen scarf. "I needed to see you. Peyton came home last night in tears. The things your partner said to her at the restaurant, they were harsh. But that is not why I am here. I came to warn you." He looked around the pristine reception area, as if expecting Barbara to materialize from behind a potted ficus. He treated my mother like an omniscient force of nature, an entity that could not be fought, only survived. "Your mother is furious," he continued, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "She knows about the magazine valuation. She knows Trent is underwater. She is planning a family reunion. Caitlin! She intends to ambush you with a formal demand for financial support. She wants a sit-down to discuss your obligations to your sister." He offered a weak, tight-lipped smile, expecting profound gratitude. He wanted me to view him as the benevolent savior, the insider, feeding me intelligence to protect me from the wicked queen. I did not offer him a lifeline. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stand in the uncomfortable void he had created. I watched the nervous energy ripple through his posture. "Do you remember the night of the blizzard?" I asked. My tone was conversational, devoid of any rising anger. Richard shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. The color began to drain from his weathered face. "I was lying in a trauma bay," I continued, my voice echoing slightly against the glass walls. "My ribs were fractured. I was bleeding internally. I called my mother, begging for someone to come. She told me I was ruining Peyton's perfect day. I know," he whispered, staring at the toes of his expensive leather loafers. "You were sitting right next to her," I said. "You were drinking champagne. You were preparing to eat a slice of a pristine cake. You listened to her tell your bleeding daughter not to be an inconvenience, and you said nothing. You did not grab your coat. You did not demand the valet bring your car. You sat in your chair because standing up would have ruined your quiet evening." "I wanted to come," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "You know how your mother gets. Once she makes a decision, there is no stopping her. It would have caused a huge scene at the reception. I thought you were in good hands with the doctors. I thought it would be easier to visit the next day." "Easier for you," I corrected my words, slicing through his excuses with surgical precision. "Everything you have ever done in your life has been calibrated to protect your own comfort. You let her erase me because fighting for me required courage you do not possess." He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping to track through the deep wrinkles mapping his cheek. "I am sorry, Katie. I am so sorry. Please, just take the card. Let me help you prepare for what she is going to do." I did not accept his pity, and I refused to grant him the absolution he desperately craved. A warning delivered in the shadows did not erase a betrayal committed in the light. I turned toward the reception desk. Our security guard, a retired state trooper named Marcus, had been watching the interaction with professional vigilance. "Marcus," I called out, my voice ringing clear across the lobby. "This gentleman is not on the visitor log. He bypassed the ground floor security checkpoint. Please escort him to the street. If he attempts to enter the building again, flag him for trespassing." Richard's head snapped up. His eyes widened in genuine shock. He had expected anger. He had expected me to scream, to cry, to hurl accusations based on decades of resentment. He had not expected to be treated like a mundane corporate liability. "Caitlin, please," he stammered, reaching out a shaking hand. Marcus stepped out from behind the mahogany desk, his broad frame easily blocking my father's path. "Time to go, sir," the guard instructed, gesturing toward the elevator bank with a firm, unyielding hand. Richard looked at me one last time, searching for a flicker of hesitation, a sign that the old, compliant daughter still existed somewhere beneath the tailored suit. He found nothing but cold, audited truth. His shoulders slumped further, accepting the finality of the eviction. He placed the coffee shop gift card on the edge of the glass reception table, turned around, and allowed Marcus to guide him into the waiting elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing him away. I stood in the empty lobby, my breathing steady, the knot in my stomach untangling itself. The cost of his inaction was finally paid in full. He had permanently lost a daughter to maintain his wife's comfort, and he would have to live the rest of his life knowing the exact price of that trade. A door opened down the adjacent hallway. Maya stepped out of her corner office holding a stack of legal briefs. She walked over to the reception area, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the concrete. She glanced at the closed elevator doors, then down at the glass table. She picked up the generic paper sleeve, sliding the plastic gift card out with her thumb. $20, Maya observed, turning the plastic rectangle over in her hands, evaluating it like a piece of crucial evidence. The exact market value of a coward's conscience. She did not ask if I was okay. She knew I was. Instead, she slipped the gift card into the pocket of her blazer, a tiny piece of leverage saved for a rainy day. "He said Barbara is planning a reunion," I told Maya, turning to walk toward my office. "She wants a formal sit-down to demand financial support for Trent's failing portfolio." Maya fell into step beside me. "Peyton's failure at the restaurant means they know we will not negotiate in private. If Barbara wants to force your hand, she is going to choose a battlefield where she believes she holds the high ground. She is going to weaponize her social circle to trap you." I pushed open my glass office door, looking out over the sprawling Denver skyline. I know exactly where she will do it. The annual philanthropic gala is this weekend. Half of the federal contractors vetting our firm will be in attendance. Maya's expression tightened into a lethal, anticipating smile. "Then we need to ensure our evening wear matches our litigation strategy." The private skirmishes were over. Barbara's impending attack was no longer a shadow creeping under the door. It was a battering ram aimed directly at my public reputation. The looming threat guaranteed the next collision would happen under the brightest chandeliers in the city, and I had 3 days to prepare for war. The Crystal Atrium in downtown Denver was an architectural marvel of vaulted glass and polished brass. Tonight it served as the hunting ground for the annual Rocky Mountain Philanthropic Gala. This was not a standard charity dinner filled with silent auctions and polite speeches. It was a calculated display of regional power, a gathering where state politicians, real estate tycoons, and federal procurement officers mingled under the glow of cascading chandeliers. For our firm, attendance was a mandatory strategic maneuver. Securing the federal auditing contract required more than flawless spreadsheets and encrypted data protocols. It required pristine social currency. We needed to prove we belonged in the rooms where the most closely guarded funds in the state were allocated. Julian stood beside me wearing a tailored midnight tuxedo that fit his athletic frame perfectly. He was currently discussing infrastructure tax incentives with a senior director from the Department of Transportation. I held a flute of sparkling water, smiling at precise intervals, projecting the image of a stable, unshakable founder. We were winning the room. Every interaction was smooth, every handshake secured another layer of trust, with the federal delegates inspecting our every move. My mother built her entire identity around these specific types of events. Growing up, I watched Barbara spend weeks curating her wardrobe for the Aspen Winter Charity Circuit. She viewed philanthropy not as a vehicle for civic change, but as a weapon for social dominance. She utilized charitable foundations to launder her reputation, ensuring everyone in her orbit viewed her as a pillar of grace and generosity. I knew she would never willingly miss an event of this magnitude. More importantly, I knew the guest list provided the perfect audience for a public execution. The string quartet in the center of the atrium shifted into a lively sonata, signaling the transition from the cocktail hour to the seated dinner. Julian touched the small of my back, guiding me toward our reserved table near the front stage. We were intercepting the federal director for one final pleasantry when a sudden flurry of movement disrupted the elegant flow of the crowd. A local society photographer stepped backward, raising a heavy camera with a glaring flash. Through the blinding bursts of white light, Barbara materialized. She wore an emerald silk gown that commanded immediate, inescapable attention. Trent walked a half-step behind her, his posture stiff inside a designer tuxedo that likely cost a month of his unpaid construction wages. He scanned the room with the frantic energy of a cornered animal, but Barbara was entirely in her element. She possessed a terrifying innate ability to weaponize public sentiment. If private intimidation in a restaurant failed and secret lobbying in my lobby resulted in eviction, she would trap me in the one place I could not fight back without destroying my own empire. Caitlin Barber cried out, pitching her voice loud enough to silence the surrounding conversations. The federal director paused, looking over his shoulder. The surrounding elite turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the sudden dramatic entry. Barbara stepped into the clearing, opening her arms wide, her face arranged into a flawless mask of overwhelming maternal relief. "Oh, my beautiful girl," Barbara exclaimed, closing the distance before I could pivot away. "We have missed you so much. We have been worried sick about you. It has been far too long, but family is everything. Family is always everything." She threw her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a suffocating, perfume-heavy embrace. The photographer snapped 3 rapid photos capturing the heartwarming reunion of a devoted mother and her successful estranged daughter. The trap was brilliant in its terrifying simplicity. Barbara knew I was courting the federal delegates standing less than 5 feet away. The government despises instability. If I pulled away, if I raised my voice or caused a scene to defend my boundaries, I would instantly be labeled erratic, emotional, and unfit for a high-stakes government contract. My pristine reputation would shatter under the weight of a public family feud broadcasted across the society pages. But if I submitted, if I allowed her to dictate the narrative, she would secure a permanent foothold in my life, using the photographs as undeniable proof of our reconciliation to extract the capital Trent so desperately needed. She expected me to freeze. She expected the quiet, compliant girl she raised to prioritize public decorum over personal survival. I did not freeze. I leaned into the embrace. I placed my hands on her emerald silk shoulders and squeezed, plastering a flawless, radiant smile onto my face for the flashing cameras. To the outside observer, we were the picture of healed generational trauma. Behind the shield of my smile, I positioned my lips inches from my mother's ear. I lowered my voice to a sharp register that only she could hear, stripping away the warmth until my words were nothing but jagged ice. "I know about the veil leans, Mom," I whispered. I felt her entire body rigidify. The theatrical warmth radiating from her skin vanished, replaced by a cold, sudden panic. Her manicured hands clamped down on my arms, her fingernails biting into the fabric of my dress. "I know Trent is carrying a terminal debt load." I continued, keeping my smile perfectly intact as another camera flash illuminated the space. "I know his mezzanine lenders are preparing to call their notes, and I know you came here tonight to extort a bailout to save your crumbling image." Barbara tried to pull back, desperate to escape the surgical dissection of her reality, but I maintained my firm grip on her shoulders, holding her firmly in the spotlight she had created. "If you do not turn around and walk out of this atrium right now, I murmured, my tone conversational and pleasant. "I will not just cut you off. I will personally launch a forensic audit into your Aspen Charity Foundation. I will trace every dollar of donor funds, every inflated expense report, and every offshore account you use to fund your lifestyle. I will hand the findings directly to the IRS division chief, who happens to be sitting at my table tonight." I released my grip and took a slow step back, letting the ambient noise of the gala rush back into the space between us. The physical transformation was startling. Barbara's plastered smile cracked. The corners of her mouth trembled as the blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and hollow. Her eyes darted toward the federal director standing nearby, suddenly realizing the scale of the power dynamic she had blindly walked into. She had brought a social guilt trip to a financial war, and she had just been outmaneuvered on her own battlefield. Trent stepped forward, sensing the drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure. He looked at Barbara, then at me. His pristine veneers remained hidden behind a tight, bloodless line. The arrogance he projected at the country club was gone, replaced by the sheer terror of a man watching his final lifeline turn into a hangman's knot. He saw the cold calculation in my gaze and understood, perhaps for the very first time, that I was not just wealthy, I was exceptionally dangerous. Julian stepped seamlessly to my side, offering a polite, dismissive nod to my mother. "If you will excuse us, Barbara, the Department of Transportation is waiting for our consultation." Barbara could not form a coherent response. Her throat worked silently. She nodded once, a jerky mechanical motion, and turned away. She grabbed Trent's sleeve, pulling him toward the nearest exit. Their retreat was swift and deeply humiliating. The photographer lowered his camera, sensing the sudden evaporation of the moment, while the surrounding guests returned to their champagne, entirely oblivious to the quiet execution that had just occurred in their midst. Julian handed me my sparkling water, his dark eyes tracking their departure through the crowd. "You handled that perfectly." I took a slow sip, the cold liquid soothing my dry throat. She thought public pressure would break me. She miscalculated the structural integrity of my walls. Julian frowned slightly, watching Trent glance over his shoulder before disappearing through the brass doors. "The mother is neutralized," Julian noted. "But look at your brother-in-law. He is not walking away with his tail between his legs. He is calculating his next move." I followed Julian's gaze, realizing the truth in his observation. Trent's posture had shifted from sheer panic to something far more volatile. He was a drowning man, and I had just kicked away the only piece of driftwood in the ocean. Desperation breeds recklessness. The gala continued, the string quartet playing a joyful melody, but the air felt charged with a new, distinct threat. The confrontation had not secured peace. It had merely ended the Cold War. Trent was humiliated, cornered, and fully aware that my knowledge of his finances could put him in a federal penitentiary. A man in his desperate position would realize that defensive maneuvers were no longer sufficient. If he wanted to survive the impending collapse of his real estate empire, he had to strike first. He had to neutralize me before I could release the audit, pushing the conflict out of the ballroom and into a high-stakes legal arena, where the collateral damage could destroy everything I had built. 72 hours after the gala, the retaliation arrived. It did not come in the form of a phone call or a desperate text message. It arrived via bonded courier, requiring a signature sealed inside a thick manila envelope bearing the silver crest of Sterling & Cross. They were a boutique litigation firm known throughout Colorado for one specific specialty. They did not win cases in courtrooms. They won them in the press, utilizing character assassination and public humiliation to force early settlements. Trent had hired the most expensive legal mercenary in Denver. A man in the middle of a liquidity crisis does not hire premium lawyers unless he believes the return on investment will save his life. Maya sliced the envelope open with a brass letter opener. She extracted the documents, her dark eyes scanning the heavy stock paper. I sat across from her in our conference room, watching her jaw tighten. When I was 19, I needed a singular collegiate loan to cover my final semester tuition. I had worked 3 jobs to fund my education, but a sudden tuition hike left a narrow gap. Richard had co-signed that specific note. I paid the balance in full 10 years ago. The account was closed, but in the world of high-stakes litigation, closed accounts could be resurrected to create an illusion of financial entanglement. Trent was preparing to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. His lawyer intended to list my firm as an entangled corporate entity, using that ancient co-signed loan as a pretense to force a public discovery process. The legal logic was flimsy, bordering on sanctionable, but the merit of the threat was irrelevant. The true weapon was the headline. If a federal vetting committee saw a subpoena linking my name to a collapsing, fraudulent real estate developer, the federal auditing contract would evaporate overnight. Trent was holding a grenade, threatening to pull the pin unless I wired a 7-figure settlement to his offshore accounts to make the subpoena disappear. He wanted to drag my pristine reputation into his messy, impending financial ruin. Maya tossed the document onto the table. "This is extortion dressed up in a designer suit," she stated, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "The discovery motion is a fishing expedition. I can file a motion to quash, but Sterling and Cross will leak the initial filing to the business journals before a judge even reviews my response. The damage to your federal bid will be done the moment the ink hits the public docket." I looked at the legal threat. Trent thought he was playing chess, moving pieces on a board he believed he controlled. He expected me to panic. He expected me to call my lawyers, draft a settlement, and quietly pay the ransom to protect my life's work. If we fight this in the daylight, I noted, we lose the federal contract. We need him to drop the subpoena voluntarily. We need him to think he has already won. Julian leaned against the glass wall, crossing his arms. "How do you make a desperate man stand down?" "You feed his arrogance," I replied. I picked up my phone. I did not dial Trent or his bulldog litigator. I dialed Peyton. I needed a conduit, someone who would run back to Trent with a false narrative that would stroke his ego and lower his guard. I took a deep breath, dropping the cold, guarded posture I had maintained for 3 years. I forced my breathing to become shallow. I introduced a slight, manufactured tremor into my hand as I held the device. The phone rang twice before Peyton answered. Her voice dripped with a smug, triumphant satisfaction. "Hello," Caitlin Peyton purred. "I imagine you received the courier this morning. Trent said you might be calling, Peyton." I started, letting my voice crack perfectly on the second syllable. "Peyton, you have to tell him to stop. You cannot do this." There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. Peyton was drinking in the sound of my desperation. It was a currency she had been denied for 1,000 days. "Trent is just protecting his business interests," Peyton replied, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "You were so hostile at the gala, Caitlin, you gave him no choice. He needs capital, and your firm is legally entangled. It is just business." "It is not just business," I pleaded, squeezing my eyes shut to sell the performance. "We do not have the liquidity he is asking for. Our capital is tied up in escrow for the federal bid. If Trent files that subpoena, the government will audit our reserves. The scandal will ruin us. We will lose the contract and the firm will go under. Please, Peyton, I am begging you, give me a few weeks to liquidate some assets. Just tell him to hold off on the filing." I could practically hear the arrogant smile stretching across my sister's face. She had finally achieved the dynamic she craved. I was on my knees, begging for her mercy, positioned exactly where she believed I belonged. "I will speak to Trent," Peyton said, her voice dripping with royal benevolence. "But you need to understand, Caitlin, family loyalty goes both ways. We expect a gesture of good faith very soon." "I will get the money I promised," my voice a frantic whisper. "Just hold off the lawyers." I ended the call. The moment the screen went black, the tremor in my hand vanished. My posture straightened. The manufactured panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. The red herring was deployed. Peyton would report back to Trent, assuring him that my firm was scrambling illiquid and terrified. Trent would instruct his lawyers to pause the filing, wanting to wait for a larger payout. He would become arrogant, careless, and entirely blind to the predator moving in the dark. I looked at Maya and Julian. "The defensive perimeter is down," I announced. "Let us go to war." We transitioned into the glass-walled conference room, transforming the space into a forensic war room. The blinds were drawn, the fluorescent lights hummed a steady clinical note overhead. We ordered black coffee and locked the doors. For the next 48 hours, the outside world ceased to exist. Forensic accounting is the art of following shadows. Wealthy criminals do not leave their money in standard checking accounts. They bury their capital beneath layers of corporate obfuscation. They use shell companies in business-friendly jurisdictions to mask ownership. They execute shady transfers between subsidiaries to create the illusion of legitimate revenue. I sat in front of a bank of 3 monitors, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled the property records for Trent's stalled Vale project. I bypassed the standard public filings, utilizing our proprietary software to trace the origin of the initial construction loans. Julian stood at the whiteboard, a black marker in his hand, mapping the corporate hierarchy. He drew a box labeled Vale Retail Associates, drawing a line to a parent company registered in Delaware. The Delaware LLC is a ghost, Julian noted, capping the marker. No employees, no physical address beyond a registered agent storefront in Wilmington. The managing director is listed as a corporate proxy. Trace the tax identification number Maya instructed from the corner sofa where she was reviewing Trent's previous civil litigation history. The proxy has to file a return somewhere. I routed the search parameters through an international database, watching the code cascade across my center screen. I found a secondary transfer. The Delaware LLC was paying exorbitant consulting fees to a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic money laundering funnel. Trent was bleeding his own construction project dry, siphoning the investor capital out of Colorado and hiding it offshore, intentionally driving the Vale project into bankruptcy while keeping the cash for himself. The listeners are pulled into the intricate, high-stakes world of forensic accounting. Every keystroke peeled back a layer of deceit. We were no longer playing defense against a bully. We were actively hunting a criminal in the shadows, armed with the tools to dismantle his entire life. But the offshore funnel was not the anomaly that stopped my heart. As the sun began to rise over the Denver skyline, painting the glass walls of our war room in pale shades of orange, I found a tertiary transfer protocol. The Cayman Island Trust was routing a fraction of the stolen money back into the United States. It was a systematic, recurring deposit perfectly structured to avoid federal reporting thresholds. I zoomed in on the receiving account. The routing number belonged to a local bank in Aspen. The account holder was not a corporation. It was a philanthropic entity. Julian? I whispered, the exhaustion vanishing from my system in an instant. Look at this routing path. Julian stepped behind my chair, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the data flow. Maya stood up, walking over to join us. The 3 of us stared at the screen, the silence in the war room suddenly thick and suffocating. Trent is not just hiding money offshore, I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the servers. He is laundering the returning capital right back into Colorado. Maya leaned forward, her finger tracing the name of the receiving entity on the glowing monitor. The funds were flowing directly into Barbara's prized country club charity foundation. My mother was not just a clueless socialite married to a cowardly man. She was actively presiding over the repository for Trent's stolen millions. We had just unearthed the fraud, but the most devastating discovery was still waiting in the digital archives hidden inside a single forged signature. The glowing monitor illuminated the dark conference room, casting a pale blue light across the glass walls. I stared at the routing data, my eyes tracing the digital pathway over and over again to ensure the math was correct. The offshore funds were not just entering any domestic account, they were funneling directly into the Aspen Heritage Foundation. It was the philanthropic crown jewel of my mother's social empire. I leaned closer to the screen, my gaze catching on the name of the intermediary shell company facilitating the transfer, Apex Holdings. The hum of the servers faded into the background, the sterile air of the war room dissolved, replaced by a sudden vivid memory from 5 years ago. It was a Tuesday evening in April. I was sitting at the cramped kitchen table of my old apartment, nursing a mug of cheap instant coffee. Rain lashed against the single-pane window. Trent had arrived unannounced, smelling of premium cologne and carrying a disorganized shoebox full of receipts. He and Peyton had been married for 12 months. My mother had called me earlier that afternoon, instructing me to help her new son-in-law organize his tax filings as a favor to the family. I was conditioned to comply. I spent 4 hours untangling his chaotic ledger. Near the bottom of the box, I found a single unfiled incorporation document for a Cayman-based entity called Apex Holdings. When I asked him about it, Trent had offered a dismissive, patronizing laugh. "Just a small offshore venture, Caitlin. Nothing to worry about. Keep it off the primary return." I had hesitated, feeling a brief pulse of professional unease, but the desire to earn my family's approval overrode my instinct. I omitted the entity. I dismissed the anomaly. The memory evaporated, snapping me back to the present. The timeline clicked into place with terrifying precision. The fraud did not start recently. Trent did not panic and begin laundering money because of a current real estate downturn. Apex Holdings was incorporated the exact same year Peyton walked down the aisle. The extravagant wedding, the custom silk gowns, the leased European sports cars, the country club memberships, all of it was funded by a criminal enterprise from the very beginning. My sister's entire marriage was a financial illusion built on stolen capital. Pull the federal tax disclosures for the charity, Maya instructed, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. If Barbara is presiding over the foundation receiving laundered funds, someone has to be signing the annual IRS 990 forms. We need to know who is authorizing the incoming deposits. I opened a secure portal to the Federal Registry. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the federal tax identification number for the Aspen Heritage Foundation. A list of digitized documents populated on the screen. I selected the most recent filing, downloading the heavy PDF file. Julian stepped up right behind my chair. He placed a hand on my shoulder, sensing the sudden drop in the atmospheric pressure. I scrolled past the balance sheets, past the listed board of directors, where my mother's name sat in bold print as the active chairperson. I bypassed the itemized charitable disbursements, scrolling down to the final page. The penalty of perjury declaration, the signature line. I expected to see Richard's messy, hesitant scrawl. I expected to see Barbara's elegant looping cursive. The document loaded, the signature rendered in crisp black ink. It was a sharp, angular script. The loop of the letter K was distinct, followed by a harsh cross on the letter T. It was my name, Caitlin Thompson. The air vanished from the war room. I stopped breathing. The blood roared in my ears, a deafening rush of adrenaline and sheer disbelief. I leaned forward, my face inches from the monitor, analyzing the ink strokes. It was not just a forgery. It was a digital vector copy of my exact handwriting. How Julian whispered, his grip tightening on my shoulder. You have not spoken to them in 3 years? You never served on that charity board. How does he have your authorized signature on a federal tax document? I stared at the screen, the disparate pieces of the puzzle colliding with sickening velocity. The collegiate loan, the singular financial document Richard had co-signed when I was 19, the exact same closed account that Trent's bulldog litigator had resurrected 48 hours ago to threaten me with a subpoena. Trent did not just dig up an old record to create a flimsy legal pretense for extortion. He had kept a copy of my foundational financial records for years. He possessed my social security number, my early banking history, and my verified signature. He used my collegiate loan paperwork to steal my identity, I stated, my voice sounding hollow and detached, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. He did not just frame you, Maya corrected, stepping closer to the monitors, her dark eyes scanning the fraudulent signature. He designated you as the primary guarantor for the money laundering operation. He set you up as the fall guy. The scope of the betrayal settled over me, a heavy, suffocating blanket of cold truth. My brother-in-law was operating a federal crime syndicate. My mother was utilizing her charity as the vault, and they had legally positioned me to take the bullet if the authorities ever knocked on the door. If the IRS decided to audit the Aspen Heritage Foundation, they would not arrest Trent. They would not arrest Barbara. They would look at the signature on the tax disclosures, issue an indictment, and arrest me. Julian turned away from the desk, pacing the length of the glass wall, his hands running through his dark hair. This is wire fraud. This is identity theft. This is systemic tax evasion. If the Federal Vetting Committee uncovers even a fraction of this, the auditing contract is dead. The firm is dead. We will lose everything we have built. The stakes were no longer just about protecting my public reputation or avoiding a messy family scandal. The stakes were existential. Maya leaned against the edge of the conference table, her posture rigid, her mind operating 10 steps ahead. You have a choice to make, Caitlin, a very narrow, very dangerous choice. She held up 2 fingers. Option 1. Maya began, her tone clinical and uncompromising. You pay the extortion demand. You wire the 7 figures to Trent's offshore account. He uses the capital to pacify his creditors, drops the subpoena, and the immediate threat vanishes. You use your backdoor access to erase your signature from the digital registry, quietly closing the loop. You save the federal contract, you save the firm, you walk away clean, and you never speak to them again. I looked at her and my throat dry. And option 2. Maya lowered one finger. Option 2. We print these ledgers. We package the routing data, the offshore incorporation documents, and the forged tax filings. We hand the entire binder over to the Department of Justice. The silence returned, heavier than before. If we choose option 2, Julian said, stopping his pacing to look at me, we clear your name legally, but the blast radius will be catastrophic. It will trigger a massive public spectacle. Trent will face a decade in a federal penitentiary. Barbara will be indicted as a co-conspirator. Your mother will go to prison. The media circus will drag your name through the mud anyway, and the federal vetting committee might revoke our bid just to avoid the collateral damage. I stared at the fraudulent signature on the screen. The choice was a razor-wire tightrope. Paying the ransom was the logical, safe business maneuver. It was what a cold, calculating chief executive would do to protect a billion-dollar federal bid. It guaranteed the survival of my empire, but it also meant submitting to their extortion. It meant allowing them to use me one final time as the shock absorber for their toxic choices. If I pulled the trigger and handed the evidence to the authorities, I would annihilate my own bloodline. I would send my mother to a concrete cell. I would destroy my sister's life. I would be engaging in the exact public scandal I had spent 3 years desperately trying to avoid. I closed my eyes. I thought about the hospital room. I thought about the string quartet playing in the background while I struggled to breathe. I thought about my father handing me a $20 gift card, asking me to absorb the blow so he could maintain his quiet comfort. They had never offered me mercy. They had only ever offered me a ledger of debts I did not owe. I opened my eyes. The hesitation was gone. The frightened girl who organized shoeboxes of receipts for their approval was dead. I was a forensic accountant, and the math was finally settled. I will not pay the ransom, I announced, my voice steady, ringing with finality. I am not hiding anymore. We do not bury the evidence, we weaponize it. Julian exhaled a long breath, a slow smile spreading across his face. Maya simply nodded, stepping back toward the conference table. As if sensing the shift in the universe, my phone vibrated on the glass desk. A new email notification illuminated the screen. The sender was a cheap, generic estate attorney representing my mother. Barbara, entirely unaware that I had mapped her criminal network and unearthed her fatal mistake, had just sent her formal demand. She was stepping willingly into the crosshairs, blinded by her own arrogance, ready to claim a victory she had already lost. The email glowing on my glass desk did not originate from the premium downtown litigation firm Trent had hired to threaten me. It came from a man named Thomas Reynolds, a strip mall estate attorney based in a wealthy suburb of Aspen. The shift in legal representation was a telling tactical maneuver. Trent's high-priced bulldog was handling the aggressive subpoena, acting as the sheer brute force. Barbara was utilizing a local pliant attorney to deliver the velvet glove. They were executing a classic squeeze, orchestrating pressure from two sides to ensure I collapsed exactly where they wanted me. I clicked open the message, allowing the clinical white screen to illuminate the dark conference room. Julian and Maya stepped up behind my chair, their eyes tracking the paragraphs of dense, self-righteous text. Thomas Reynolds did not write like a standard lawyer. He wrote like a man taking direct dictation from a matriarch who believed the universe revolved around her social calendar. The subject line read, "Confidential Settlement and Family Healing Initiative." The audacity of the phrasing sent a cold ripple down my spine. I read the text aloud, my voice steady, stripped of all inflection. Dear Caitlin, on behalf of your mother, Barbara Thompson, and your extended family, we seek to formally resolve the unfortunate estrangement that has characterized the past 3 years. Your family recognizes that unexpected wealth can create isolating circumstances. In the spirit of reconciliation and to protect the legacy of the Thompson name from impending public scrutiny regarding your brother-in-law's business ventures, Barbara proposes a unified path forward. She is requesting a $1.5 million capital investment into Trent's primary holding company. This gesture of good faith will stabilize the family portfolio, satisfy the pending legal discovery motions, and serve as a restorative step to compensate for your selfish absence during crucial family milestones. I stopped reading. The silence in the war room was profound, broken only by the steady hum of our servers processing data in the background. $1.5 million. That was the exact price tag Barbara had placed on my submission. She did not ask for a loan. She did not offer equity in the Vail project. She framed a blatant 7-figure extortion demand as a necessary penalty fee for my failure to attend Sunday dinners and holiday galas. The demand was layered with such breathtaking entitlement that it bypassed anger and registered as pure clinical fascination. She genuinely believed that throwing the word family into a legal threat negated the criminality of the act. She thought she was offering me a lifeline to buy back her affection, wholly unaware that she had just handed a forensic accounting firm a documented written record of an extortion attempt. Maya leaned over my shoulder, her dark eyes scanning the signature block of the estate attorney. "This man is a fool," she murmured, her tone laced with professional disgust. "He just put his own bar license on the line by transmitting a financial threat tied to a fraudulent enterprise. Barbara must be paying him double his standard hourly rate to ignore the ethical violations." "She thinks she has already won," Julian added, crossing his arms and leaning against the glass wall. "Peyton took your fake panic at face value. She ran back up the mountain and told them you were terrified of the subpoena, that our firm was illiquid, and that the federal auditing contract was hanging by a thread. They think you are backed into a corner, bleeding out, desperate for a quiet exit." "They think they are dealing with the girl they left in the hospital," I replied, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "They think I am going to negotiate." I clicked the reply button. I did not draft a lengthy rebuttal. I did not involve Maya to cite extortion statutes or threaten countersuits. Engaging in a legal back and forth would only signal that their pressure campaign held merit. It would validate their illusion of power. A predator does not negotiate with the snare. It simply closes the jaws. I typed a single definitive line: "Meeting accepted, Friday at 10 a.m., my office." I pressed send. The message vanished into the digital ether, traveling instantly to the mountains where it would inevitably be printed, celebrated, and viewed as an unconditional surrender. I could visualize the reaction in Aspen perfectly. Barbara would be sitting in her sunroom, sipping herbal tea, wearing a triumphant, condescending smile. She would turn to Trent and Peyton, holding up the confirmation like a trophy. She would gloat, validating her lifelong belief that everyone eventually submits to her authority. They would spend the next 48 hours picking out their outfits, deciding which designer watches and tailored suits would best project their superiority when they arrived to collect their ransom. They were celebrating a victory march that was actually a funeral procession. The dramatic irony was heavy, a suffocating blanket of impending doom that they were entirely too arrogant to notice. They were walking willingly, eagerly, into a meticulously laid trap. "Print the ledgers," I instructed, standing up from the desk. "The defensive phase is officially over. We assemble the execution file." The next 2 days blurred into a marathon of rigorous, unyielding preparation. Forensic accounting requires an obsessive attention to detail, a devotion to sequential logic that leaves no room for interpretation. If I was going to accuse my brother-in-law of federal wire fraud and my mother of operating a money laundering repository, the evidence had to be bulletproof. Our high-capacity printers ran for hours, churning out reams of heavy premium paper. We did not use standard office folders. We required packaging that conveyed the severe, undeniable gravity of the contents. Maya procured a dozen heavy navy blue 3-ring binders. The color was dark, imposing, and entirely devoid of warmth. We worked in a synchronized, lethal rhythm. Julian organized the financial flowcharts mapping the journey of the stolen construction capital from the stalled Vail project through the Delaware proxy into the Cayman Islands Trust and finally back into Barbara's Aspen Heritage Foundation. He printed large, glossy diagrams with sharp red arrows tracing the illicit current. Maya handled the statutory cross-referencing. She categorized every federal code violation, attaching the corresponding penalty parameters to each fraudulent transaction. She built a legal appendix so dense and terrifying it could make a seasoned defense attorney break into a cold sweat. I handled the final component, the forgery. I printed the false IRS 990 forms containing the unauthorized vector copy of my signature. I placed them alongside authenticated copies of my actual signature from our firm's incorporation documents, highlighting the digital discrepancies. As I snapped the metal rings of the final navy blue binder shut, the sharp metallic click echoed through the quiet office like the closing of a bank vault. I ran my hand over the textured cover. Inside those binders lay a decade of deceit, a legacy of theft, and the undeniable proof of a family that had cannibalized its own bloodline for social currency. Thursday night descended over Denver, wrapping the city in a cold, starry darkness. The war room was finally still. The binders sat in a neat, imposing stack at the center of the long mahogany conference table, waiting for their audience. Julian brought in a tray of takeout coffee, handing a steaming cup to Maya and another to me. We stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the grid of city lights. We did not celebrate. There was no joy in the impending destruction, only a solemn, heavy recognition of necessity. This was the family I had chosen. Two people who had stood by my hospital bed, built an empire by my side, and spent 72 sleepless hours constructing a shield to protect me from the people who should have loved me. "Go home and sleep," Caitlin Maya said softly, taking a sip of her dark roast. "The trap is set. The bait is taken. Tomorrow, we just have to close the door." I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, listening to the steady rhythm of Julian breathing beside me. I felt a strange, profound calm settling over my nervous system. The anxiety that had plagued my childhood, the desperate, hollow yearning for Barbara's approval, was entirely gone. The emotional ledger was balanced. Friday morning broke with a piercing, crystalline clarity. The Colorado sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, spilling bright, unforgiving light across the Denver skyline. I stood in front of my closet selecting my armor. I chose a tailored slate gray suit. The cut was sharp, structured, and entirely uncompromising. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot, stripping away any softness from my silhouette. I applied my makeup with minimalist precision, creating a mask of cold, unreadable authority. When I arrived at the office, the 40th floor was eerily quiet. My staff had been instructed to clear the reception area and remain in the secondary wing. The stage was set. The audience was en route. I walked into my private office and stood by the glass window looking down at the crawling morning traffic far below. At 10 o'clock, the elevator chimes would ring. The people who had discarded me for a slice of wedding cake would step onto my floor, expecting to find a broken, terrified girl, ready to surrender her kingdom. I checked my watch. 9:45. I adjusted my cuffs, my emotional armor, perfectly in place. The reckoning, 3 years in the making, was no longer a distant threat. It was riding the elevator up, and I was entirely ready to collect the debt. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, the elevator chimes echoed through the quiet expanse of the 40th floor. The sound was a sharp, digital note that signaled the arrival of the enemy. I sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, my spine straight against the leather chair. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, casting long geometric shadows across the polished wood. I did not look toward the frosted glass doors of the boardroom. I kept my gaze fixed on the empty space directly in front of me, waiting for the theater to begin. The heavy doors swung inward. The synchronized rhythm of expensive leather shoes striking the concrete floor announced their entrance. Barbara led the procession. She wore a tailored cream suit, her posture radiating the unearned authority of a visiting monarch arriving to collect tribute from a conquered province. Her chin was lifted, her expression arranged into a mask of weary, benevolent grace. She walked into the room as if she owned the building, the firm and the air circulating through the vents. Peyton followed closely behind, flanking her mother like a loyal lieutenant. She wore a smug, triumphant smile, her eyes darting around the sleek boardroom, silently calculating the square footage and estimating the cost of the custom light fixtures. Peyton believed her false report of my financial panic had secured this victory. She carried the arrogant confidence of someone who thought she had outsmarted a predator by poking it with a stick. Trent entered third. The sheer panic he displayed at the charity gala had evaporated, replaced by a manufactured, hollow swagger. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, rolling his shoulders back, attempting to project the image of a titan of industry rather than a man facing federal indictment. The red herring had worked flawlessly. Trent believed my firm was drowning in illiquidity, terrified of his impending subpoena, and eager to write a seven-figure check just to keep our name out of the business journals. Richard brought up the rear. My father walked with his shoulders slumped, his gaze anchored to the polished concrete. He did not look at me. He hovered near the doorway, a ghost haunting a room he had no desire to occupy. They stepped up to the mahogany table. Trent pulled out the chair directly opposite me at the far end, attempting a crude territorial power play. The distance only served to highlight how small he truly was. Barbara took the seat to his right, placing her designer handbag on the table with a soft, deliberate thud. Peyton sat next to her mother. Richard quietly slipped into a chair near the corner, positioning himself as far from the center of gravity as physical space would allow. I sat at the head of the table, an unreadable static force. Julian sat to my right, leaning back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He was the silent sentinel, observing their movements with the detached interest of a scientist studying an unpredictable chemical reaction. Maya sat to my left. She placed a thick, heavy leather briefcase on the table in front of her. The metal clasps gleamed under the overhead lights. Trent eyed the briefcase, a smug twitch pulling at the corner of his mouth. He undoubtedly believed the leather satchel contained a drafted settlement agreement, a non-disclosure contract, and a cashier's check made out to his offshore holding company. He was looking at his own execution file and smiling at it. Before Barbara could open her mouth to launch her opening salvo, Maya reached for a paper cup resting beside her legal pad. The cardboard sleeve bore the distinct stamped logo of a small roastery located near my old apartment. It was the exact brand of espresso my father had attempted to offer me 3 days prior. Maya took a slow, deliberate sip. She lowered the cup, locking her dark eyes onto my father across the length of the room. "Thank you for the coffee, Richard," Maya said, her voice smooth and devoid of any gratitude. "It is an excellent roast. $20 goes a surprisingly long way when it is spent correctly." Richard's head snapped up. The remaining color drained from his weathered face, leaving him the shade of old parchment. He recognized the logo. He recognized the exact sum. The tiny, pathetic olive branch he had used to buy his conscience had just funded the caffeine fueling the lawyer about to dismantle his family. Peyton frowned, confused by the interaction, but Barbara quickly waved a dismissive hand, refusing to let a subordinate disrupt her stage. Barbara cleared her throat, a soft, polite sound designed to command the room. She folded her manicured hands on the polished wood. The performance began. Caitlin Barbara started pitching her voice into a soft, melodic register, intended to convey deep maternal sorrow. "We did not come here today to fight. We came here to heal. The past 3 years have been a terrible, unnecessary tragedy. Families should never be separated by petty misunderstandings." I listened to her frame my survival as a petty misunderstanding. I did not blink. I did not offer a nod of encouragement. I simply watched the muscles in her face work, analyzing the presentation the way I would analyze a fraudulent expense report. "You isolated yourself," Barbara continued, her tone shifting slightly to weave the guilt into the narrative. "You ran away when things became difficult. We gave you space because we thought you needed time to mature. But seeing you at the gala, seeing the hostility you carried, it broke my heart. I realized we could not wait any longer. A mother knows when her child is crying out for structure." Peyton nodded in solemn agreement, playing her supporting role with practiced ease. Trent steepled his fingers, looking toward the ceiling as if bored by the emotional preamble, eager for the financial transaction to commence. Barbara reached into her designer handbag. She extracted a square of white silk. She held the handkerchief ready before the first tear even materialized, proving the biological reaction was entirely premeditated. She blinked rapidly, forcing a shimmering layer of moisture into her eyes. "Your sister needs you," Barbara whispered, dabbing the dry corner of her eye with the silk square. "Trent has encountered some unfortunate market headwinds. It happens to the best developers. But the stress is tearing their marriage apart. You have built a successful little firm here, Caitlin. You have resources. You have a duty, a blood obligation, to protect your family when they stumble." She lowered the handkerchief, her gaze hardening into something far more transactional. "We are asking for a bridge, a gesture of good faith to repair the damage your absence has caused. $1.5 million, injected directly into Trent's primary holding company. It will satisfy his immediate creditors, stabilize Peyton's household, and prove that you are finally ready to rejoin this family." She framed the extortion as a noble cause. She transformed a ransom demand into an investment in family unity. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. Behind my static expression, my mind was scrolling through the digital routing codes we had unearthed in the war room. I knew exactly where that $1.5 million would go. It would not pay local contractors. It would not stabilize a real estate portfolio. It would bounce through a Delaware proxy, cross international waters into a Cayman Islands trust, and wash right back into the Aspen Heritage Foundation. She was asking me to fund my own framing. She was demanding I finance the very criminal enterprise that was currently using my forged signature as a federal shield. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of her demand hung in the air, a toxic cloud filling the sleek boardroom. Barbara leaned back in her chair, a soft, expectant smile gracing her lips. She waited for the capitulation. She expected my shoulders to slump. She expected me to reach into my desk, pull out a corporate checkbook, and purchase my way back into her good graces. The silence stretched across the mahogany table. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Maya turned her left wrist outward. She stared at the face of her stainless steel watch. She did not try to hide the gesture. She sighed a quiet, distinct sound of profound boredom. It was the universal sound of a high-powered professional realizing her time was being wasted by amateurs. The contrast was jarring. Barbara's high-stakes theatrical production was met with nothing but clinical apathy. Peyton's smug smile faltered. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather squeaking under his weight. He looked at the heavy briefcase resting under Maya's hands, suddenly uncertain if it contained a settlement or a trapdoor. Barbara frowned, the maternal facade cracking just enough to reveal the impatient dictator beneath. "Well, Caitlin," Barbara prompted, her voice losing its melodic softness, taking on the sharp edge of a command. "We are waiting for your response. Do we have an agreement?" I let the silence hang for 5 more seconds. I allowed her to sit at the absolute pinnacle of her false victory, suspended in the air, entirely unaware that the ground below her had been replaced with spikes. I placed my hands flat on the cool, polished wood of the table. I was ready to present the final balance sheet. The silence in the boardroom was heavier than a scream. I let the quiet stretch, allowing Barbara's demand to hang in the air until the sheer absurdity of it became a physical weight pressing down on the room. I did not yell. I did not display a single flicker of anger. Outrage implies a lingering emotional investment, a hope that the offending party might suddenly recognize their cruelty and apologize. I harbored no such hope. I viewed the people sitting across from me not as family members, but as hostile creditors, attempting to collect a debt they did not own. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I reached toward a slim manila folder resting on the mahogany surface in front of me. I opened the cover. I extracted a single sheet of heavy stock parchment paper. I placed my index finger on the top edge and slid it across the smooth expanse of the table. The paper glided silently, stopping directly in the center of their defensive line. Trent leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Peyton craned her neck, eager to witness what she assumed was a printed confirmation of a wire transfer. Barbara lowered her gaze, a triumphant smile already forming on her lips, fully expecting to see a routing number or a signed settlement agreement releasing them from their financial nightmare. What she saw was a standard corporate invoice. It was formatted using the exact proprietary software my firm utilized to bill our most delinquent, uncooperative accounts. The document was crisp, clinical, and devoid of any familial warmth. The top line detailed their current demand, $1.5 million. I had categorized the request under the billing heading of extortion and fraudulent capital injection. Directly below that figure, I had constructed a secondary column. It itemized the exact costs I had incurred 3 winters ago, presented down to the final cent. $42,000 for emergency trauma surgery, $18,000 for a 2-week stay in the intensive care unit, $12,000 for 6 months of rigorous physical therapy, $700 for the ambulance ride from the snowy wreckage on Interstate 70, I spoke with the precise, detached tone of an auditor presenting a final balance sheet to a bankrupt board of directors. "You are asking for a bridge," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. "You are demanding a seven-figure investment to repair the damage caused by my absence. I want to make sure our ledgers are perfectly aligned before we authorize any transactions." Barbara stared at the paper, the triumphant smile evaporating from her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a mottled ashen gray. She looked up at me, her eyes flashing with a sudden cornered indignation. "This is a joke," Barbara snapped, dropping the benevolent matriarch routine instantly. "You are mocking us. We came here in good faith to offer you a chance to heal this family, and you present us with a sarcastic medical bill?" "I am merely balancing the accounts," I replied, my posture remaining static and unyielding. "You claim family is a blood obligation. You claim we owe each other a duty of care, and that my wealth dictates my responsibility to save Peyton's marriage. Yet when I was lying in a trauma bay with a punctured lung and a shattered rib cage, you did not perceive any such obligation." Peyton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her gaze dropping to her lap. She picked at a loose thread on her designer skirt, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. Richard shrank further into his corner seat, staring at the floor as if praying the concrete would open and swallow him whole. Trent adjusted his silk tie, his manufactured swagger dissolving into a deep, creeping unease. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool wood of the table. I locked my eyes onto Barbara's. "We cannot leave your sister's wedding." I recited the words with pristine, terrifying clarity, replicating the exact clipped impatience she had used on the phone 3 years ago. "They are about to cut the cake. Stop making a scene." The words struck the center of the table like physical blows. They hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. I watched Barbara swallow hard, her throat working as she searched for a deflection, a justification, any rhetorical weapon to regain the high ground. She found nothing. She could not play the grieving wounded mother when her own documented cruelty was sitting printed on the parchment in front of her. "You operated under the assumption that our relationship functioned on a currency of guilt." I explained my tone, remaining entirely conversational, stripping away the emotional leverage she thought she held. "You believed that if you threw the word family into a legal threat, I would revert to the quiet, compliant girl who desperately wanted a seat at your dinner table. You thought I would pay $1.5 million just to avoid your disapproval." I paused, letting the reality of their failure sink into their bones. "But you fundamentally miscalculated the market rate of your affection," I continued. "Your approval holds zero value here. This relationship is nothing more than a failed transaction, and I do not throw good capital after bad investments." The psychological tension in the boardroom peaked. The shift in power was palpable, a sudden drop in barometric pressure that left the invaders struggling to breathe. They realized their guilt trips possessed no currency. Their manipulation tactics were useless against a target who refused to participate in the game. Trent realized the emotional angle had collapsed. He decided to intervene, relying on the brute force of his legal strategy. He leaned across the table, planting his hands firmly on the mahogany surface, attempting to physically intimidate me. "You can be as bitter as you want," Caitlin, Trent sneered, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register. "You can print all the sarcastic invoices you desire, but my lawyer sent a formal request, and my litigation team is prepared to file a discovery subpoena tomorrow morning in federal court. If you do not fund this investment, we will drag your pristine auditing firm into my bankruptcy proceedings. Your precious federal contract will burn to the ground. You have no choice. We have the leverage." Barbara straightened her spine, drawing strength from Trent's aggressive posture. She retreated to her final defense mechanism, the illusion of legal superiority. "Trent is right," Barbara added, her voice regaining a fraction of its former arrogance. "You might not care about this family, Caitlin, but you care about your money. You care about your reputation. If you want to keep your little empire intact, you will fund the holding company. We will not leave this building without an agreement." I looked at Trent, then at Barbara. They were clinging to their extortion plot, genuinely believing the threat of a public subpoena still gave them the high ground. They thought the invoice I had just presented was the entirety of my defense, a petty display of resentment before an inevitable quiet surrender. They had no idea the invoice was merely the appetizer. It was just the preliminary paperwork required to open the vault. I did not argue with them. I did not point out the fatal flaw in their logic, nor did I explain that their legal leverage was a phantom built on a foundation of sand. I simply leaned back in my leather chair and nodded to the woman sitting to my left. The time for balancing the emotional ledger was officially over. It was time to audit the criminal one. Maya did not smile. She did not offer a dramatic preamble. She simply reached forward and placed her hands on the thick, heavy leather briefcase resting on the table. She unclasped the heavy brass locks. The sharp, metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. The sound signaled the end of the negotiation, the closing of the trap, and the absolute destruction of everything my family had spent their entire lives building. Maya did not rush. She unfastened the heavy brass latches of the leather briefcase with deliberate care. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the quiet boardroom, sounding remarkably like the cocking of a loaded weapon. She reached inside and retrieved the first binder. It was bound in thick navy blue vinyl, measuring 3 inches across the spine. She lifted it and let it fall onto the mahogany table. A dull, heavy thud reverberated through the wood. She reached into the briefcase a second time. The second binder fell next to the first. Another resonating thud. She produced the third and final binder, aligning it perfectly with the others. The 3 volumes sat in the center of the table, an imposing monument of audited truth. Trent stared at the dark spines, his manufactured confidence beginning to waver. Peyton leaned back in her chair, sensing the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. Barbara frowned, her maternal facade slipping to reveal genuine confusion. "What is this?" Barbara demanded, her voice tight and defensive. "We asked for a financial commitment, not a reading assignment. This is the actual invoice," I replied, keeping my posture entirely static. I reached out and opened the cover of the first binder. I flipped past the title page directly to the glossy flowchart Julian had constructed in the war room. It detailed the complex network of corporate entities tied to the stalled Vale real estate project. I turned the binder around and pushed it across the table toward my brother-in-law. I began reading the routing data aloud, my voice ringing with clinical precision. I cited the initial construction loans. I named the Delaware Proxy Corporation. I listed the offshore holding trust registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Holdings. Trent's breathing stopped. His face turned the color of wet cement. The smug arrogance he had carried into the room vanished, replaced by the sheer, paralyzing terror of a criminal realizing his vault had been breached. I tracked the flow of capital, I explained, watching his eyes dart frantically across the flowchart. The money did not disappear into a declining real estate market. You siphoned the investor funds out of the construction accounts, bounced them through the Caribbean to avoid federal oversight, and routed them back into the United States. Barbara gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked at Trent, expecting him to offer a loud, indignant denial. He offered nothing. He sat frozen, staring at the undeniable proof of his own fraud. The laundered capital landed squarely in the operating accounts of the Aspen Heritage Foundation, I stated, shifting my gaze to my mother. "You are funneling stolen construction funds through a philanthropic entity. You turned your prized charity into a money laundering repository." Peyton gasped, pressing a hand over her mouth. She looked back and forth between her husband and her mother, the pristine designer illusion of her life shattering into jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. Trent finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling rasp. "These are private corporate documents," he stammered, attempting to summon a legal defense out of thin air. "You obtained this data illegally. This is inadmissible in any court." Maya did not even look at him. She opened the second binder, extracted a single piece of heavy stock paper, and slid it across the table to rest beside the flowchart. It was the penalty of perjury declaration from the Federal Tax Registry. The signature line was highlighted in stark yellow ink. "You kept my collegiate loan paperwork," I told Trent, my tone devoid of anger, but heavy with lethal intent. "You kept my Social Security number and my early banking records. You copied my signature and applied it to the annual tax disclosures for the charity. You positioned me to take the federal indictment when the authorities finally decided to audit the foundation. You planned to sacrifice me to save yourselves." Richard let out a strangled, broken gasp from his seat in the corner. He buried his face in his hands, unable to look at the daughter his wife and son-in-law had conspired to destroy. "You have no proof," Barbara whispered, though her voice shook. "You cannot prove who signed those federal forms. If you take this binder to the authorities, you will go down with us. The scandal will ruin your precious federal contract anyway." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that did not reach my eyes. "I am not taking this to the authorities," I said. "That would trigger a public spectacle. That would invite government scrutiny into my life. I told you I do not throw good capital after bad investments. I prefer a much cleaner resolution." I closed the binders, the metal rings snapping shut. I steepled my fingers, leaning forward to deliver the ultimate retaliation. "You sent an extortion demand under the assumption that I was scrambling for liquidity," I continued. "Peyton ran back to Aspen and reported that my firm was terrified of your impending subpoena. You believed the red herring I fed her on the phone. You thought you were hunting a wounded animal." Trent swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The realization that he had been entirely outmaneuvered began to sink into his posture, forcing his shoulders to slump. "While you were busy drafting legal threats and planning this ridiculous ambush, I was shopping on the private equity market," I explained, keeping my voice smooth and relentless. "I knew your mezzanine lenders were preparing to call their notes. You were desperate for a sudden capital injection. You instructed your financial brokers to pitch your toxic debt to any holding company willing to assume the high risk." Trent's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He realized exactly where the narrative was heading. "You pitched a dummy corporation registered out of Chicago," Julian added, speaking for the first time since the meeting commenced. "A firm operating under the name Horizon Financial. They offered to purchase your most critical debt at a significant premium. You signed the transfer agreements yesterday afternoon." Trent's jaw dropped. He looked at Julian, then slowly turned his gaze back to me, shaking his head in silent, desperate denial. "I own Horizon Financial." I stated the words falling like a heavy steel door slamming shut. "I bought your debt, Trent. I did not just audit your failing company. I purchased it outright. I am now your primary creditor. You owe me the principal, you owe me the exorbitant interest, and you owe me the late penalties. I own the Vail project. I own the heavy equipment leases." The boardroom descended into a suffocating, terrifying silence. The power dynamic inverted with blinding speed. I did not just hold emotional boundaries, I held the actual deed to their lives. "But that is not the best part," Maya interjected, leaning forward on her elbows, a predatory gleam in her dark eyes. "When you restructured those loans to funnel the stolen money into the charity, you cross-collateralized the debt. You used the Aspen Heritage Foundation building and its remaining legitimate endowments as the legal guarantee for the mezzanine notes." Barbara let out a sharp, choked cry, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck. "Because your loans are currently in terminal default," I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "The primary creditor reserves the right to seize the collateral immediately. Horizon Financial executed the seizure protocols at 9 o'clock this morning." Barbara shook her head, tears of genuine, profound devastation spilling over her pristine makeup. "No," she gasped, struggling to draw breath. "That is my foundation. That is my legacy. You cannot take my charity from me." "I already did," I replied, feeling no pity for the tears streaming down her face. "The deed transferred an hour ago, and since I am the sole proprietor of the new asset, I have decided to rebrand the facility." I watched my mother's face carefully, ensuring she absorbed every single syllable of her impending social ruin. "The Aspen Heritage Foundation no longer exists," I announced. "The building is being entirely repurposed. It will open next month as a specialized trauma recovery center, specifically dedicated to providing long-term physical therapy for victims of severe automotive accidents." The poetic justice landed with devastating surgical precision. The foundation Barbara used to launder her reputation and hide stolen money was now a permanent monument to the exact tragedy she ignored when she chose a slice of wedding cake over my life. She would have to drive past it every single day. Her wealthy country club friends would attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. She would be reminded of her failure every time she opened a local newspaper. The trap had snapped shut perfectly. Trent gripped his hair, staring blankly at the mahogany table. He had handed his own financial noose to the executioner, signing away his leverage for a fake bailout. Peyton covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing quietly as the designer illusion of her marriage evaporated into thin air. I placed my hand flat on top of the navy blue binders. "Here are the new terms of our relationship," I declared, sweeping my gaze across the 4 fractured individuals sitting in my boardroom. "You will drop the legal subpoena immediately. You will vacate the Vail properties by midnight tonight. You will never set foot in the city of Denver again." I paused, letting the final threat hang in the cold air. "If you ever attempt to contact me, Julian Ermaya," I promised, my tone dropping into a deadly, uncompromising whisper, "if you send an email, if you mail a letter, if you look in our general direction, these 3 binders go directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. You will not face a civil lawsuit. You will face a decade in a federal penitentiary." I sat back in my leather chair. I had stripped away their social currency, their stolen wealth, and their false dignity. I legally and financially owned my abusers, securing permanent leverage over their future. The ledger was finally undeniably balanced. But surviving an execution does not mean the condemned walk away quietly. As the reality of their utter destruction settled over the room, the fractured alliances within the toxic unit began to shatter, turning them against each other in a desperate, frantic bid for survival. The heavy silence following my ultimatum stretched until it became a fragile thing ready to shatter. The psychological collapse of the people sitting across from me did not happen in stages. It occurred all at once. The unified front they had carried into my boardroom disintegrated, revealing the hollow transactional nature of their loyalty. They were a syndicate built on shared greed, and the moment the capital evaporated, they turned on each other with the instinct of starving animals. Trent was the first to break. The manufactured swagger he wore like a shield melted away, leaving a terrified, cornered man in its place. He stared at the navy blue binders resting on the table as if they were venomous snakes poised to strike. His chest heaved. He pushed his leather chair backward. The legs scraped harshly against the polished concrete floor, a jarring sound that echoed off the glass walls. He stumbled to his feet, putting physical distance between himself and the evidence of his federal crimes. "I need to make a call," Trent stammered, his hands patting the pockets of his bespoke suit in a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. "I need to call the litigator. We can fix this. There has to be a legal loophole in the transfer agreements." "You sold your debt to a holding company you thought was a desperate private equity firm," Julian pointed out, his voice calm and measured. "You signed the transfer deeds willingly. Your bulldog litigator cannot unring a bell you rang yourself. You handed over the keys to your entire portfolio." Trent backed away until his shoulders hit the glass wall of the conference room. He looked at Peyton, his eyes wide and frantic. "We are ruined," he whispered, the reality of his impending federal indictment crushing the remaining breath from his lungs. "They have the routing numbers. They have the offshore trusts. I am going to prison." Peyton sat frozen for a fraction of a second. She processed Trent's words, watching the designer illusion of her life vanish into thin air. The ski chalets, the luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, all of it was gone. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was the wife of a disgraced, bankrupt felon. She slowly turned her head to look at Barbara, the golden child, the daughter who had spent 32 years basking in the warmth of maternal approval, finally realized the true cost of her inheritance. "This is your fault," Peyton said. Her voice started as a low, dangerous hiss before escalating into a shrill, piercing scream. "This is all your fault!" Barbara flinched, reeling back, as if her favorite daughter had just struck her across the face. "Peyton, please lower your voice. We need to think strategically." Strategically, Peyton shrieked, slamming her palms flat against the mahogany table. "You told me to marry him. You told me his family name was a guaranteed investment. You orchestrated this entire life for the optics. You knew his developments were failing years ago, and you helped him hide the money through your foundation just to keep up appearances. You sacrificed my future so you could host charity dinners and pretend we were royalty." The polished, elegant facade Peyton had cultivated for years burned away, leaving a desperate, angry woman stripping the matriarch of her crown. The mother and daughter alliance forged in shared entitlement shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "You ruined my life," Peyton cried, tears of pure rage streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "I have nothing left. I am tied to a criminal because you wanted a son-in-law who looked good in a tuxedo." Barbara raised her hands trembling, trying to pacify the monster she had created. "I did everything for this family," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of the accusation. "I protected our legacy. I secured our standing in the community." "Your standing is a trauma recovery center," Peyton spat, pointing a shaking finger toward the window, toward the mountains in the distance. "Your legacy is a federal investigation. You have nothing either." The brutal exchange hung in the air, a testament to the toxic foundation of their household. They were tearing each other apart, and I did not have to lift a single finger. I sat at the head of the table, an impartial witness to their self-inflicted destruction. Richard could no longer tolerate the crossfire. My father, who had spent decades blending into the wallpaper, finally found a shred of courage. It was an astonishingly poorly timed arrival. He stood up from his corner seat, his face pale, his hands shaking at his sides. "Katie, please," Richard begged, stepping forward, his eyes pleading for mercy. "She is your mother. Peyton is your sister. You have made your point. You have taken the money and the buildings, but you cannot do this to them. You cannot threaten them with the authorities. You have to let this go and show some compassion." I turned my gaze toward him. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Do not speak," I commanded. The words were sharp, concise, and delivered with a lethal finality that stopped him dead in his tracks. Richard opened his mouth, desperate to salvage the fractured pieces of his household, but I cut him off before a single sound could escape. "You lost your right to speak to me 3 years ago," I stated, my voice ringing with an authority that left no room for negotiation. "When I was bleeding in a hospital bed, you chose silence. When my mother erased me from this family, you chose silence. Your silence was a choice to protect your own peace while I was discarded. You do not get to find your voice today just because the consequences have finally arrived at your doorstep. Sit down and remain silent." Richard stared at me, the last embers of his parental authority extinguished forever. He looked at the floor defeated and slowly sank back into his chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands, a broken man, mourning the loss of a daughter he never truly fought to keep. Barbara, witnessing her husband silenced and her favorite daughter turning against her, experienced a final, desperate surge of panic. The realization that she held zero leverage, zero capital, and zero control over the narrative pushed her over the edge. Her eyes locked onto the navy blue binders resting on the table. In her fractured state of mind, she believed that if she could simply remove the physical evidence, she could rewind the clock and undo the disaster. She lunged forward. It was an uncoordinated, frantic movement, stripping away the last remnants of her dignified country club persona. She threw her upper body across the polished mahogany, reaching her manicured hands toward the stack of audited records. As her chest hit the edge of the heavy wooden table, the delicate strand of custom pearls resting around her neck caught on the sharp corner. The silk thread pulled taut. With a sharp, defining snap, the necklace broke. Dozens of pristine white pearls scattered across the dark mahogany surface. They bounced off the wood, raining down onto the concrete floor with a chaotic, hollow clatter that filled the boardroom. The sound was the perfect auditory representation of her crumbling empire. Maya did not flinch. With the smooth, practiced grace of a seasoned litigator, she placed her hand on the stack of binders and slid them effortlessly out of Barbara's desperate reach. Maya picked up the records, placed them back inside the heavy leather briefcase, and secured the brass latches with a resonant click. Barbara lay draped across the table, her hands grasping at empty air. She stared at the scattered pearls rolling across the floor, her breathing ragged, her dignity entirely obliterated. She slowly pushed herself back into her chair, a hollow, defeated shell of the woman who had walked into the room just 30 minutes prior. Right on cue, the frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Marcus, our head of security, stepped into the room. He was accompanied by 2 uniformed guards. They did not carry weapons, nor did they issue verbal commands. Their presence was a silent, imposing mandate. They stood in the doorway, their sheer physical proximity signaling that the meeting was officially terminated. "It is time for you to leave," I announced, standing up from my leather chair. I smoothed the lapels of my slate gray suit, looking down at the fractured syndicate occupying my space. Trent pushed himself away from the glass wall, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor as he shuffled toward the exit. Peyton stood up, grabbing her designer handbag, refusing to look at her mother or her husband. She walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving her shattered alliance behind. Richard stood slowly, offering me one final sorrowful look before following his son-in-law into the hallway. Barbara was the last to rise. She looked at the table where 3 solitary pearls remained resting on the polished wood. She did not attempt to pick them up. She looked at me, searching my face for a flicker of hesitation, a single drop of regret. She found only the cold, impenetrable walls of a fortress she could never breach. She turned around and walked out the door, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Marcus and the guards flanked them, escorting the remnants of the Aspen elite toward the private elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing them inside a metal box, descending 40 floors back down to the reality of their ruined lives. Their social currency was gone. Their financial standing was erased by their own greed. The eviction was formal, final, and deeply humiliating. I stood in the quiet boardroom listening to the hum of the city traffic through the glass. The air felt lighter, cleansed of the toxic weight I had carried for over 3 decades. I turned to Julian and Maya. The war was over. The only thing left was the peace. 7 months is a substantial period in the realm of federal investigations. The wheels of justice turn with a slow, grinding friction, but they grind exceedingly fine. I sat on a leather sofa in the great room of my custom-built home in Telluride, watching the winter snowdrift past the floor-to-ceiling windows. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the hardwood floor. On the flat-screen television mounted above the mantel, a Denver news anchor delivered the evening headlines. I muted the volume, reading the closed captions scrolling across the bottom of the screen. The segment lasted less than 2 minutes, but it encapsulated the total destruction of a fraudulent empire. Trent was indicted on a Tuesday morning. There was no dramatic raid, no sirens wailing outside the Aspen estate. White-collar criminals are handled with a quiet, lethal efficiency. Federal agents arrived at dawn wearing windbreakers and carrying sealed warrants. Trent was escorted out the front door in handcuffs, his expensive tailored jacket draped over his wrists to hide the steel. The charges included wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. He was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to the offshore accounts we had exposed. He traded his country club membership for a concrete cell. The news segment displayed a file photo of the Aspen Heritage Foundation. The reporter noted the swift seizure of the property by a private creditor detailing the ongoing renovations. The building was scheduled to open the following week as a trauma recovery center. The irony was not lost on the local press, though they lacked the personal context to understand just how profound that poetic justice truly was. With Trent facing a decade in federal prison and the real estate portfolio liquidated, the fragile ecosystem of my mother's social standing collapsed entirely. Aspen is a town that runs on a very specific currency, and Barbara was suddenly bankrupt. The country club quietly revoked her membership privileges, citing the pending IRS investigation into the charity foundation she chaired. The invitations to winter galas and private charity dinners stopped arriving. When she walked through the upscale boutiques downtown, her former friends turned their heads, pretending to admire window displays to avoid making eye contact. Barbara was trapped in a crumbling house of cards. She still lived in the sprawling estate, but the hollow silence inside those walls must have been deafening. She spent her entire life orchestrating a flawless public image, sacrificing her own daughter to maintain the illusion of perfection. Now she was a total social pariah. She had no audience left to applaud her performance, and a narcissist without an audience is a ghost haunting her own life. I pressed a button on the remote, turning the television off. The screen faded to black. I felt no guilt watching the fallout. I felt no lingering anger. I only experienced a profound, quiet closure. The emotional ledger was balanced. The debt was settled. Julian walked into the great room carrying 2 mugs of dark roast coffee. He handed one to me, taking a seat beside me on the sofa. He did not ask about the news segment. He already knew the details. The federal vetting committee had cleared our firm a month prior, awarding us the billion-dollar auditing contract. We had excised the infected tissue, saving our life's work in the process. "I have something you might find interesting," Julian said, his voice soft, respecting the quiet atmosphere of the room. He pulled a tablet from his sweater pocket and tapped the screen a few times before handing it to me. It was a security camera still, from the lobby of a commercial high-rise in downtown Denver. Our firm managed the real estate portfolio for the building's primary tenant. The timestamp indicated the photo was taken earlier that afternoon. A woman sat in one of the waiting area chairs. She wore a standard off-the-rack gray suit. Her posture was stiff, her shoulders hunched forward as she nervously gripped a thin manila folder resting on her lap. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, unstyled knot. It was Peyton. "She is applying for the open receptionist position on the 7th floor," Julian explained, taking a sip of his coffee. The hiring manager flagged her name during the preliminary background check and forwarded the feed to my office. I stared at the image of my sister. She was stripped of her designer facade, devoid of the smug, arrogant confidence she had paraded through the restaurant and my boardroom. The leased sports cars were gone. The luxury ski chalets were foreclosed. She was just a desperate woman clutching a resume, hoping to secure an hourly wage, answering phones in a building her estranged sister technically oversaw. "Do you want me to instruct the hiring manager to reject the application?" Julian asked, watching my face carefully. I looked at the digital image for a long time. The old Caitlin, the girl who craved revenge for a lifetime of mistreatment, might have relished the opportunity to deny her employment. But that girl died in a Denver trauma unit 3 years ago. The woman sitting by the fire in Telluride operated on logic and audited facts. "No," I replied, handing the tablet back to him. "Let the hiring manager evaluate her on her own merits. If she types fast enough, she gets the job. Her survival is no longer my responsibility, and her failure is no longer my concern. She is just another applicant." Julian smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He set the tablet aside and wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The ghost of my family was finally laid to rest. November arrived, bringing heavy snowfall and a biting chill to the San Juan Mountains. The passage of time ushered in Thanksgiving Day. For 32 years, Thanksgiving was an exercise in psychological endurance. I remembered sitting at Barbara's long dining table surrounded by fine china and crystal goblets, measuring every word I spoke to avoid triggering her quiet, stinging judgment. I remembered the hollow conversations, the forced smiles, and the suffocating pressure to perform the role of the grateful subordinate daughter. This year, the holiday looked entirely different. We avoided the toxic traditions of the past, choosing to build something new from the ground up. Our mountain home smelled of roasted herbs, cracked black pepper, and burning cedar. There was no fine china, no assigned seating, and zero drama. Julian stood in the open kitchen, wearing a comfortable flannel shirt, expertly carving a roasted turkey while humming a steady, cheerful tune. The front door opened, letting in a gust of crisp winter air. Maya stepped into the foyer, shaking the snow from her dark hair. She traded her usual razor-sharp litigation suits for a heavy knit sweater and denim jeans. She carried 2 bottles of premium red wine and a bakery box filled with fresh pastries. "I survived the holiday traffic," Maya announced, walking into the kitchen and setting the wine on the granite island. "The highways were a nightmare, but I refused to let Julian hoard all the good stuffing." Julian laughed, handing her a glass of wine. "You are just in time. The ledger on this kitchen is officially balanced." We moved to the rustic wooden dining table positioned near the crackling fire. We did not bother with formal place settings. We filled our plates, poured the wine, and sat together in the warm, inviting glow of the room. The conversation flowed easily, shifting from the complexities of our new federal contract to shared jokes and quiet reflections. There was no underlying tension. There was no fear of saying the wrong thing. There was only genuine connection rooted in mutual respect and undeniable loyalty. I looked across the table at Maya, who was gesturing animatedly while recounting a story about a recent deposition. I looked at Julian, who was smiling at me over the rim of his wineglass, his eyes reflecting the firelight. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of the roasted food and the burning cedar fill my lungs. The physical scars on my ribs still ached when the weather turned cold, but the psychological wounds were entirely healed. The final realization hit me with a deep, resonant, emotional clarity. Family is not defined by the people who share your bloodline. It is not defined by the individuals who demand your presence to maintain their social optics, or the people who expect you to absorb their toxic choices under the guise of loyalty. Family is the people who show up when your world shatters. It is the people who stand guard at your hospital door when you are too broken to defend yourself. It is the people who help you build a fortress, who sit in a war room for 72 hours to protect your future, and who fight for you when you cannot fight for yourself. I raise my glass, the dark red wine catching the light from the hearth. Julian and Maya raise their glasses in return, the crystal clinking together in a soft, musical note that echoed through the peaceful home. The math of my life was finally perfectly settled. The deficit I had carried for 3 decades was erased, replaced by a wealth I could actually trust. If you have ever had to close the ledger on toxic bloodlines to find your true family, share this story with someone who needs the strength to walk away. Keep your receipts, hold your boundaries, and never negotiate your worth. Thank you for listening to Linda Vengeance. I will see you in the next one. We often speak of family as a sanctuary, a steady anchor in the unpredictable, fast-paced storms of American life. We are taught from a young age that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred contract that guarantees a seat at the table no matter how far we wander or how hard we fall. But what happens when that table is built entirely on conditions? What happens when a mother and father view their children not as human beings to be nurtured and guided, but as assets on a balance sheet? The story of Caitlin Thompson, a daughter left bleeding in a Denver hospital while her parents clinked champagne glasses at a lavish Aspen wedding, forces us to confront the darkest, most uncomfortable realities of the traditional family structure. It strips away the polished veneer of the American dream to ask a terrifying question. Are we raising our children with unconditional love and emotional awareness? Or are we simply investing in the child who best serves our own ego? In so many traditional households, driven by a culture that idolizes optics and material success, there exists an unspoken hierarchy. We see it in the way parents divide their attention, their praise, and their resources. In the Thompson family, Peyton was the golden child. She was the gleaming trophy meant to validate her mother's social standing in the wealthy enclaves of Colorado. Caitlin was the ledger, the quiet shock absorber, expected to manage the family's emotional deficits without ever asking for a return on her investment. This dynamic represents a profound failure of fundamental fairness in parenting. When parents play favorites, they are not just harming the child left in the shadows, they are crippling the golden child too. Peyton was raised to believe that love was intrinsically tied to optics, leaving her entirely unequipped for the harsh, unforgiving realities of the real world. She became an adult who mistook a fraudulent, crumbling marriage for success because she was taught that appearances mattered more than truth. Fairness in parenting is not about buying equal gifts or paying equal tuition. It is about providing equal emotional safety. It is the steady, unwavering assurance that every child under your roof has intrinsic value regardless of how brightly they shine in the eyes of the neighborhood. The tragedy of Caitlin's story is not just the dramatic financial extortion at the end, it is the decades of emotional dishonesty that preceded it. Richard, the silent father, represents a specific kind of parental failure that quietly plagues too many homes. He confused keeping the peace with being a good father. He allowed his wife's toxic narcissism to dictate the emotional climate of his household, slipping $20 gift cards into the shadows to buy off his own conscience rather than standing up for his daughter in the daylight. True family responsibility demands courage. It requires the emotional awareness to recognize when a household has become toxic and the unflinching honesty to intervene. Parents are the primary architects of a child's reality. When a father looks away while a mother systematically erases a child, he teaches that child that her pain is invisible and her boundaries do not matter. We must ask ourselves if we are acting with true integrity in our homes, or if we are merely surviving our own families at the expense of our children's mental health. Long-term guidance for children in modern American culture cannot be outsourced to trust funds, prestigious universities, or country club memberships. These are superficial markers of success that crumble into dust the moment real adversity strikes. True guidance is found in the grit of showing up. It is found in the cold hospital rooms, the quiet moments of failure, and the messy, unglamorous trenches of life. Barbara's fatal flaw was believing that her maternal duty ended at providing a wealthy, picture-perfect facade. She failed to understand the most basic law of human connection. You cannot demand a dividend from a relationship you never emotionally invested in. When you raise children, you are essentially auditioning for a role in their adult lives. If you teach them that your love is a transaction, do not be surprised when they eventually close the account. Caitlin's ultimate victory was not the millions she amassed, nor the federal contract she secured. Her victory was learning that she did not have to absorb her family's toxicity to be worthy of love. We are witnessing a cultural shift where the definition of family is being actively redefined by necessity. When the traditional structure fails to provide honesty and fairness, the scapegoats, the forgotten children, and the quiet survivors go out into the world and build their own fortresses. They find their own chosen families, the people who offer the fierce, uncompromising loyalty that their bloodline denied them. This should serve as a sobering wake-up call for any parent navigating the complexities of raising a family today. The title of mother or father is not a lifetime guarantee. It is a lease that must be renewed through consistent, honest, and emotionally aware behavior. The moment a child realizes they can survive the blizzard without you, your leverage is gone forever. These are the stories that force us to look in the mirror and evaluate the foundations we are building within our own homes. If you have ever had to close the door on toxic traditions, or if you are in the process of building a chosen family that truly honors your worth, you are not alone. I invite you to subscribe and follow the channel Linda Vengeance. We are building a community dedicated to unpacking the complex, sometimes painful, but ultimately empowering realities of family dynamics, boundaries, and the strength it takes to rewrite your own story. Join us, and let's navigate these truths together. As the dust settles on the Thompson family's ruins, we are left to ponder the silent echoes of that Denver boardroom. The heavy navy blue binders, the shattered pearls scattered across the mahogany table, and the quiet, humiliating descent in the elevator, they all speak to the ghosts of choices made decades prior. A mother's passing remark, a father's averted gaze, a sister's smug, entitled smile. These are the tiny, seemingly insignificant seeds from which a bitter harvest eventually grows. It makes you look at your own dining room table, doesn't it? Look at the empty chairs, or the people currently sitting in them. The math of our lives is being tallied every single day in every quiet interaction and every unspoken assumption. We are all actively writing the ledgers of our own legacies. The question that lingers in the quiet, lonely hours of the night is simply this: when the final accounting is done and the ones you raised are standing at the head of the table, what kind of invoice will they slide across to you?